Trove's combat and how you build classes can be broken up into 3 categories. Speed farming, where you're trying to complete dungeons as fast as possible, which means you need to have a class that has a good base movement speed and you will be sacrificing damage for more speed. Delves, which is a combination of damage and health. In most cases, you need to be really tanky to be able to survive the long, drawn-out gauntlet. And Leviathans are all about damage. You don't need to survive if you can kill it before it kills you. The efficiency of a class can basically be broken down into these 3 categories. Some will be stronger than others in one area and weaker in another. Another video of mine that I would recommend is the classes cheat sheet. It's basically a visual graph that kind of shows where each character fits in the spectrum. At the end of it all, I would always recommend that you play the class that you enjoy, rather than picking something specifically because it's efficient. So assuming you've picked out your main, let's get started with the more detailed tutorial. Die, fish! So first, let's talk about the Knight. Now, the Knight is a very unassuming class that you might think is not very good at anything other than being adorable. I mean, just look at him. His character model was actually based off of a teapot. If you have movement speed on all of your gear, not like the footage that you're seeing right now, the Knight can be pretty good for speed farming. Most of all because he's got the damage, which is why the class is also fairly proficient at doing delves. He's not the best when it comes to killing Leviathans, although he does definitely work well enough. But before we move on, I have a very important question to ask. Do you like holding left click? Because this is 90% of the Knight's gameplay. So there's 2 subclass options that you can use with the Knight. One would be Solarion, just because the sheer amount of light that you end up getting out of it. And otherwise, Lunar Lancer. Because when the Lunar Lancer subclass triggers, you're going to end up going big mode and get a little bit of movement speed boost and a lot of extra damage. So depending on which category of the game you're trying to tackle, you would end up having movement speed and attack speed on your gear for dungeons. But if you're doing delves or even Leviathans, you would want to simply swap the movement speed out for crit damage on your gear. Now, the best crystal ring effect that you're looking for is Overcharge, which is going to end up giving you a movement speed boost after you use your dash ability. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself by mentioning this, but you obviously don't want to be using your class gem on the Knight. The banner you're looking for is just going to end up being the ones that you get from Leviathans. The best ally on slot is going to be Scorpius, because you get light, physical damage, health when an enemy dies, and movement speed. How do you get Scorpius? Well, if you come over here in the hub, there's going to end up being the skill tree. You're going to have to go up the skill tree into here in order to end up unlocking Scorpius. While we're here, I should also mention that this is what I have for my star chart. In here, we're going to end up having not only lifesteal, which essentially makes all characters invincible at this point, but I have all the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and this one right here, which gives us the 15% physical damage. Now, your flask is kind of up to you. Death Defying is pretty pointless as soon as you end up getting that life steal out of the skill tree, but I just kind of use it out of laziness because I don't like popping flask very often. Conjurer's Crucible is one of the big ones that a lot of people use because when Magic Find triggers, if you have a lot of Magic Find, you can essentially have infinite flask without having to restock. Valorous has a chance of recharging a flask when you get a crit hit. Vampiric is after you defeat an enemy, but again, for my money, I always just go with Death Defying. As for the emblems, you have a couple different options. Martial Emblem is going to be a must, but when you're early on in the game, Sure Strike can be invaluable just when you're still struggling with your stats. And if you absolutely need survivability, you can use the Unyielding Emblem. But when you're at the true end game, you'll use Trailblazing for movement speed, or you could use the Beamer Emblem Eye just to give you a little bit of extra damage when you're fighting bosses. So the stats that you're going to focus on, I'm going to kind of summarize from a mid to end game. This is kind of ballpark estimate what you want to aim for. Just ignore the numbers that you're seeing on your screen and listen to the words that I'm saying instead. I do not have my Knight built up. You want to have around 80,000 base physical damage. Crit hit you want to get at 50 to 60% minimum, just because Sure Strike can end up helping with that. But your ultimate goal is to get to 100% crit hit, no more than that. Your crit damage, I would suggest 800 to 1000%. Again, all of these numbers are just a base minimum, and then you will work up from there. So now I'm going to swap to my Shadow Hunter because we're going to be talking about gems, and I have all of my best physical gems on my Shadow Hunter. I get questions all the time about people wondering what stats they should be going for, why their PR is so low, because you don't have a maxed out class yet. You have to get max level and equip your gems, and then and only then can you actually start focusing on the stats and PR. To keep things simple, the way that you want to boost your gems or get them pearled is you want to end up having them at a 3/3 ratio for your lesser gems. So 3 lesser gems would be 2 boosts physical, 1 boost crit, and then no boost into crit hit or max health. While the other 3 lesser gems would be 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost physical, and again, no boost to crit hit or max health. Now, for me personally, I actually just make all of the empower gems 2 boost physical, 1 boost crit damage, no boost to max health or crit hit. The cosmic gems are a lot more complicated though, because you want to try and get 3 boosts into the light, with the additional stats just being physical damage and crit damage. I want to emphasize that this is merely a suggestion. There is slightly more optimal things that you can do with the boosts, but obviously that would require either a lot of contained chaos sparks or chaos flares to swap those boosts around or swap your stats around. If in some cases you have like 3 boosts physical, 3 boost crit damage, like it doesn't really matter that much so long as your gems are maxed out. For your empowered gems, Pyro Disc is a must just because the movement speed boost that it ends up giving you. Now, the rest of the empowered gems don't matter that much. In fact, you're going to have 2 additional extra slots, which is 1 more slot than most classes have, because you don't want to have your class gem ability. The dash ability on the knight is far better than the ability you get from his class gem. And the funny thing is that your base attack is going to deal a lot more damage than your class gem ability does. Cubic Curtain is another gem that I would recommend just because the survivability it gives you, but it's not as mandatory as Pyrodisc. As for the Cosmic Gem ability, that depends, because the Vampirium gem will end up giving you movement speed and life leech, so it can be more optimal if you're trying to speed farm, but Berserk Battler is going to be better for raw damage just because it's going to give you a lot more light. Today we're going to be covering the Pirate Captain. Pirate Captain is one of those classes that everyone kind of underestimates. Like, you wouldn't believe the amount of people that say, oh, this is a bad class or it's not very strong. And that's because, generally speaking, the class doesn't feel very strong right away. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it for speed farming, but you could use it as a boss killer, because there's kind of a trick that you can do where you throw down one of your ultimate ability and then you use the chromatic emblem to reduce your cooldown so that you can throw down another one and another one. And yeah, essentially you can end up stacking tons and tons of damage this way. But obviously you do go through a lot of potions, and it also requires a lot of time investment just because you have to wait to put down another one, versus another class that might just deal raw, strong damage right away without much button input. So for the subclass ability, you have a couple options. You could use the Knight subclass ability to give you that extra flask capacity, but generally speaking, almost all the time, everyone's going to choose Solarion just because it gives you a lot of extra light. Now, I want to address something that I didn't talk about in my most recent Knight tutorial, which is that just because I am suggesting which subclass abilities you want to use, doesn't necessarily mean that you can't experiment. A lot of the subclass abilities are a lot stronger than you would think, and you can kind of get away with using any of them. Now, ignoring the stats that I have on my gear, I would say that the priority stats that you're going to go for is going to be crit damage and attack speed. The only reason you would end up potentially swapping out the crit damage for movement speed would be if you are trying to use this class as an all-around main. So the hidden ring effect that you're going to go for with Pirate Captain, he's got a couple different options. One is all hands on deck, which uses Man of War, now summons a Parrot Cannoneer as well. A Vast Yi, basic attacks cause minions to attack the player's target, as well as applying a debuff that increases damage, and Raiders, which first mate has a chance to spawn doubloons when it hits enemies. Honestly, you can choose either a Vast Yi or all hands on deck. The best banner in pretty much all cases is going to be the torches from Leviathans, whether it be the weakest torch up to the permit torch. Your best ally in slot is going to be Starry Skyfire, because it gives you light, magic damage, and increased cooldown recovery speed, which you need for your ultimate. In order to get Starry Skyfire as an ally, you're going to have to get this node right here on the skill tree, which is fine because you need to have the light node anyway. So if you don't already know about the Trove skill tree, there's the hub. You come over here into the astrolabe, and yeah, I've got other videos that focus on the skill tree. So the main nodes that I would recommend is the lifesteal node. This will make you pretty much invincible. The movement speed nodes, just because it can be really annoying being really slow, and the light nodes, because you're gonna need that for the extra damage. Additionally, and I didn't include this in my night video, and I'm sorry about that, you can invest in these abilities right here, because these will end up giving you crit hit and crit damage. Now, for the top of the skill tree, I'm invested in both physical damage and magic damage, with physical coming a little higher. So all you would do as a magic main is swap out these two nodes for these two instead. So you have a couple different flask options. Pretty much all the ones that I have favorited are going to be the best ones in the game. Conjurer's Crucible will give you extra flash charges when you trigger Magic Find, which can end up being pretty good for you, because in my skill tree we did have Life Leech. It kind of makes you invincible with pretty much every character in the game, but for my money I still almost always just use Death Defying because I'm lazy. But in Pirate's Captain's case, you might want to end up using the Elysian Bandolier if you're trying to be a boss killer, because you need as much flash as possible. Now, your emblems are going to change based on how you play the game. It's not really that complicated, but basically when you're first starting out and you have really low crit hit, you're going to be using Sure Strike pretty much all the time, and Arcane Emblem you'll never be able to get away from, unfortunately. As you slowly end up building up enough crit, you can swap that out for Chromatic Emblem so that you can be a boss killer, because the cooldown is going to give you the advantage of being able to cast your ult multiple times. However, some other alternatives is Unyielding Emblem if your survivability is really low, and Trailblazing if you need to go fast, like say you're doing dungeons and stuff rather than bosses. So ignoring my stats that I have on the character, the stats that you're going to be aiming for is pretty much the same as in my night video. So you're going to be focusing on around 80,000 magic damage, and anything higher than that is obviously going to be very nice. I'm talking about the base magic damage, not necessarily with multipliers. Crit hit, you're honestly aiming from 60% and up. Your ultimate goal is to get it to 100%, and crit damage you want to have at 800% and higher than that. Otherwise, anything else beyond that is just going to end up being good, and you're trying to kind of keep them all even. But how do you do that? Well, that comes with the gems. Now, before we talk about the gems, I get this question a lot about people asking like how they can end up increasing their power rank and so on and so forth. And the first question I always ask them is, are you level 30? Because you need to max out a class before you even bother trying to focus on getting to the mid to end game. You need to end up having your class at 30 so that you have all of your gem slots unlocked. Now, I'm going to be swapping to my Shadow Hunter. Just keep in mind that the gem stats are basically going to be the same on Pirate, save for the physical damage is going to be swapped out for magic damage instead. I also want to be very clear, I don't have the highest coefficiency or anything. I don't really care, because I can still kill everything in this game anyways, and this video is most of all to make it as easy to understand as possible. So with that said, you'll notice on your lesser gems and in power gems that there's going to be these pearls or boosters on the stats. What you're going to be doing for your lesser gems is going 3x3. So 3 of your lesser gems are going to have magic damage 2 pearl, crit damage 1 pearl, and then crit hit. And then the other 3 gems are going to have 2 pearls crit damage, 1 pearl magic damage, no pearls crit hit. Of course, as you eventually end up getting your crit hit to 100%, then you can start cycling crit hit off of some of your gems to give you more survivability with max health. The cosmic lesser gems, however, are a little trickier to get properly set up, because you have to have all of your pearls into light, and then the extra stats obviously being magic damage and crit damage. Now, talking about empowered gem abilities, which ones are you going to be aiming for? Pyrodisc is kind of just a must for every class in the game at this point, because the amount of movement speed that you end up getting from it. Technically, you won't need it as you are building your pirate for a boss killer. Cubic Curtain can be one that will help you with a lot of survivability, just because you are going to end up getting that shield that will tank some damage for you. But are you struggling with survivability to begin with? Explosive Epilogue can be really good on Pirate Captain when you're dealing with large mobs of enemies, because with all of your turrets dealing with all of the enemies and damaging all of them, it means that when an enemy dies, they'll explode and cause chain reaction damage. Obviously not good for a boss killer because the boss isn't going to have any minions around. However, the class gem ability is highly recommended on this class because the artillery class gem will end up making it so that you can summon 2 little parakeet turret guys, which essentially gives you double their firepower. Now, lastly, there's going to end up being the Cosmic Empower gem ability, which this again depends. The Vampirium gem is going to give you a lot of survivability, but you also get a little bit of movement speed, so it can be really good if you're trying to use the character as a main for everything, including speed farming. Otherwise, Berserk Battler is going to be your best bet because this is going to end up adding light to your character that ultimately will give you a lot more damage. Ice Sage is one of those classes that used to be really good at speed farming, but now it kind of falls into the category of delves. Your base attack is going to deal most of your damage, but your right click is going to be great for dealing with mobs of enemies, which is why delves is such a good fit for the class. But it's also a really good boss killer. Subclass ability is going to either be Lunar Lancer, just because when you go big mode, you get a little boost of attack speed and a lot of damage. Solarion is going to end up being kind of the standard for everybody just because of the light value you get out of it. But for my money, I almost always end up using the Knight subclass ability, which I know seems stupid, but I like having the extra flash so that I can spam flash. And then on top of that, I primarily focus on speed farming, which is why I like having that extra mount movement speed. But another decent one, especially if you're focusing on the delves, is actually going to end up being Pirate Captain, Fae Trickster, or heck, even the Tomb Raider's ability can be okay. So the gear stats that you're going to focus on with the Ice Sage are going to vary, but generally speaking, you'll have attack speed and movement speed, except when you're trying to be a boss killer, then you might want to sacrifice the movement speed for crit damage instead. The only reason you want to have the attack speed is you will be able to have max attack speed, which is 300%, with your base attack. Now that said, your ultimate ability is going to throw your attack speed up to like over 1,000, but that's just a visual indicator. The maximum attack speed is hard capped at 300%. Now, the 3 crystal ring hidden effects are going to be Nice Ice Baby, which the Big Chill summons an ice crash on the player. This ice crash changes the ground to ice. As cold as ice. While on ice, the Ice Sage gains additional crit hit chance and critical damage. And finally, Chill Out. Frozen Ward triggers on low health. Overall, you can see these hidden ring effects are not particularly good because none of them really synchronize with the Ice Sage very well. Like, you can use as cold as ice if you're staying in ice biomes, or if you have another Ice Sage with Nice Ice Baby that is making the ground ice. Frozen Ward kind of would work, but it's also kind of useless at the same time because most of the time you're just invincible in this game. The best banner and slot is obviously just going to end up being the temporary ones that you get out of Leviathans, or the permanent torch that you can very rarely get out of Leviathans. Now, you've actually got 2 options for your best ally on slot. You can either use Starry Skyfire, which is 400 light, 25% magic damage, and then increase cooldown recovery speed by 25% so you can spam your ult more, or you can use Orchian, which is out of Paragon, and instead of giving you the cooldown reduction, gives you the movement speed boost. Orchian is right here, and as you can see, is quite expensive if you don't have like the Paragon marks and whatever else. Meanwhile, from the hub, if you come up over here, this is where the Grand Orrery is, which is the skill tree in the game. And from the middle, you're gonna go all the way over here to get Starry Skyfire as an ally. But what stats should you prioritize in the skill tree? Well, I primarily focus on the Life Leech node, the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and the damage nodes. Keeping in mind that my skill tree is set up for a physical damage character because I main Shadow Hunter, but if you're a magic damage character, you would instead remove these nodes and get these ones instead. Don't forget to grab these nodes as well because this will give you a lot more crit damage. Now, as far as your flasks are concerned, these are pretty much all going to end up being the top options without much variety between them. I always use Death Defying because I'm lazy, but because of that lifesteal we have out of the skill tree, technically we don't need it. So a lot of people use Conjurer's Crucible because every time Magic Find triggers you can get a flask back, but there's other ones that can help you with longevity of grinding as well, like Valorous Vial, which gives you a charge after you do a crit hit, or Vampiric, which has a chance to recharge after you defeat an enemy. It really depends on the situation, but later on in the game, it doesn't really matter as much as the emblem does. Speaking of the emblem, you're never going to be able to move away from the arcane emblem, unfortunately, but your secondary emblem can change around depending on where you are in the game. Early on, you want Sure Strike just because of that 20% crit hit that you'll get out of it. But eventually, if you are trying to speed farm, you can use Trailblazing, or if you need defense, you can use Unyielding. But when you're truly at the end, you'll more than likely just be using Chromatic Emblem to reduce the cooldown of your ult. Now, the mid-game stats that you're going to be focusing on are pretty much going to be the same as every other class. You're aiming for around 80k magic damage, 50% and up of crit hit, and 800 to 1000 crit damage. Keep in mind that this is just kind of a mid-game goal, and from here you just expand your stats. I'd say the top priority, at least early on when you're trying to get to the end game, is to get your crit hit to 100% first. Now, just before we end up getting into the gem portion of the video, I want to mention how important it is that you don't focus on anything to do with gems until you've gotten your class to level 30. I get the question a lot of like, how can I increase my PR or get stronger? And then I always realize that the person asking this usually isn't even max level yet. And max level gives you a huge boost of power because you'll unlock all of the gem slots. Now, I am also going to mention that I'm not 100% coefficient on my characters. I don't really care about that. This video is most of all to make this as digestible as possible. So I'm going to show you what my gems are and give you an idea of what you can follow, but you can change it up as you see fit. So ignoring the physical damage, because I only have a good set of gems on my physical characters, you're going to focus on having 3 of your lesser gems with 2 boost magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit until you have 100% crit hit. Then you can cycle that off for max health. But then the other 3 lesser gems are going to be 2 boosts to crit damage, 1 boost magic damage, and then again no boost to crit hit or max health. Your empowered gems can kind of be a variety between those, but for my money I just have 2 boosts in the raw damage type, 1 boost crit damage, no boost to max health or crit damage. Now the cosmic gems are obviously very different because you have to have all of the boosts into light, and then the extra stats are just going to end up being magic damage and crit damage. Now, as far as the empowered gem abilities, you definitely want to have the class gem ability because this thing is god tier. It basically makes it so that your basic attack now freezes an enemy for 1 second on the first hit, in addition to their existing chill. Hitting enemies 3 times in a row with basic attack causes them to explode, taking additional damage. And that can just stack like crazy, and that's where a lot of this class's damage ends up coming from. The other empowered gems are kind of optional, but I would say Pyrodisc is a really good one just for speed farming. If you don't have another class for speed farming, but you 100% main Ice Age, you always want to have Pyrodisc. You can have Explosive Epilogue. It's really, really good for delves and large groups of enemies because enemies will explode after they die, but it's not very good on bosses just because there's never usually a bunch of enemies to trigger Explosive Epilogue while you're fighting a boss. Cubic Curtain can also give you that much needed survivability you may or may not need if you're going into deep delves, but it's entirely optional. As for the Cosmic Gem, you have 2 options. Vampirium is most of all for the movement speed. It's also going to give you Life Leech, which you don't really need at this point if you have the skill tree ability. But more importantly, you're going to be using Berserk Battler because as you deal damage, it's going to slowly increase your life. Shadowhunter has always been one of my favorite characters, and now I can happily report that he's kind of the best all-around character for the game. He's really good for speed farming, he's got the damage and survivability for delves, and he also has the damage for bosses. Now, I also want to point out for returning players, Shadowhunter did end up getting a rework like a year or 2 ago, and now he's got the passive ability where when you roll, you get a movement speed boost, which is why you see me rolling constantly on the Shadowhunter. And on top of that, his basic attack will shoot through enemies and walls. But as soon as you get your Classroom ability, you can no longer shoot through enemies, but you can still shoot through walls, which makes him ideal for speed farming. So the best subclass ability for Shadowhunter is going to be pretty much the same subclass abilities you'll use on every class. I always use the Knight subclass ability because I like the extra flask capacity, and more particularly, I like the mount movement speed. Even though I don't spend much time on my mount, those few precious seconds that I do spend on my mount, I like having the movement speed. But ideally, you would be using Lunar Lancer just because, again, when you go big mode, you can end up having a huge boost of not only damage, but also movement speed. Or Solarion because of the sheer amount of light that you'll end up getting on the class, and you'll kind of get a damage over time effect when you burn enemies. So the stats you're going to be focusing on for your gear with the Shadowhunter are going to vary depending on whether you're using the class gem or not. So when you're at the early game, attack speed is going to be mandatory for your basic attack. And then you could end up having movement speed or crit damage. It doesn't really matter at that point because usually you're going to end up being quite weak when you're just using your base attack. But generally speaking, the base attack is a lot more powerful than people give credit. However, as soon as you get the class gem for the Shadowhunter, attack speed no longer will actually affect his basic attack. It's almost like the basic attack turns into a machine gun, and regardless of your attack speed, that is just what the animation is from there out with the class gem. So you could have 0 attack speed and he would still do the machine gun shot. So in that case, you would swap attack speed off on your gear and instead focus on crit damage and movement speed. For the Shadowhunter's Crystal Ring effect, you've got 3 different options. Sneaky traps, so when dodging, the Shadowhunter drops a Sun Snare, which is okay. But when you're at the end game, enemies don't get one shot by your Sun Snare, so it's not ideal to have them stunned, you know, like you would rather have them all migrate towards you so you can damage all of them at once. Tactical Seeker, when enemies take damage from the Shadowhunter's Sacred Arrow, a Shadow Seeker will fire from the Shadowhunter and attack the closest target, which is going to be your most ideal ability for the Shadowhunter for the Hidden Ring effect. But just for completionist's sake, the last ability is Unholy Heal. So when enemies with Shadow Mark are defeated, the Shadowhunter is healed a small amount. We're basically invincible at this point anyways with the skill tree, which we'll get into. The best banner in slot, of course, is going to end up being the Leviathan banners, with the Permatorch being the best one. I craft it into the Enshadowed Torch of Knotted Shadow because this is the one that has the movement speed on it. Obviously, there's a lot of different allies that you could pick, but generally speaking, Scorpius is going to be the best option for Shadowhunter because it's going to give you a bunch of light, a bunch of physical damage, and you also get a little bit of lifesteal, which doesn't really matter that much, as we'll talk about. But you get movement speed when a nearby enemy dies, and this class is all about speed. So from the hub down there, you're gonna come over into this corner, and this is where the Grand Orrery is, which is the skill tree. And right up here is where you're going to end up getting Scorpius. You're gonna kind of need this anyways, because it is one of the light nodes. Now, as far as the skill tree is concerned, there's going to end up being a few set abilities you definitely want to get your hands on. Namely, the Life Leech will make almost every class invincible, the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and the damage nodes. There's a bunch of crit damage and crit hit that you can get right here, but when you're using a Shadowhunter, which is a physical-based class, you're going to go up this skill tree right here because it's going to give you a bunch of physical damage. These are pretty much going to end up being all the best flask in the game. I always end up using Death Defying, but I fully acknowledge that I'm really lazy for doing it. Basically, it makes it so that when you take critical damage, it'll use a flask and keep you invincible. Most of all, like, I'm just so used to using this that I like the ability of being able to shut my brain off and not worry about death. But you can use Elysian Bandolier if you're trying to farm a boss because you need to alt spam. There's also Vampiric, Valorous, and most of all, Conjurer's Crucible. That's the biggest one a lot of people always suggest, because if you have high enough magic find, you'll just constantly recover your flasks while you're farming, which allows you to farm for a longer period of time before you need to recover more flasks. The emblem is going to end up changing over time and dependent on the situation. So you'll be probably using Sure Strike emblem when you're early on in the game and you need that crit damage. You will never be able to move away from Martial emblem just because of how strong enemies are. And then this is where things kind of to change a little bit because you can either use Trailblazing for dungeon farming or Chromatic Emblem for boss farming because the reduction to your cooldown. Unyielding is also a decent emblem if you need survivability. So the mid-game stats that you're going to be focusing on, of course, this isn't like a requirement, it's just kind of a suggestion, and it's just a baseline that you're going to work from. So that would end up being 80k physical damage, 50 to 60% crit hit, but you want to try your best to get that to 100%. And then your crit damage you want to have at 800% and up. Generally speaking, you try to get all of those stats to be as high as possible. But when you end up getting your crit hit to 100%, it means that you can start sacrificing crit hit on your gems and so on and so forth, and instead focus on getting like max health or just more physical damage and crit damage. So just before we end up moving on to the gems, I'd like to mention, as always, that the top priority you should be focusing on before you even start getting into gems and what you should spec them into and so on and so forth. Get your character max level. I constantly see people asking like how they can improve their PR and they're not even max level. Max level is going to make a huge difference because gems give you the bulk of PR in this game. So I also want to take a moment to mention that I don't have 100% the best co-efficiency. I don't really care about that because I can already kill everything in the game anyways. So you want 3 of your lesser gems to have 2 pearls physical damage, 1 pearl crit damage, and then no pearls into crit hit up until you have 100% crit hit, and then you can start rolling that stat off from max health instead. But then you're going to have the other 3 lesser gems doing 2 pearls crit damage, 1 pearl physical damage, no pearls crit hit. So this is just for readability so that you can just be like, okay, I just need 3 and 3. Now for your empower gems, I pretty much just have them all the same where they're 2 boost physical damage, 1 boost crit damage, and then again, no boost into crit hit or max health. The cosmic gems are a little bit more, they're a little bit pickier because you're gonna have to have all 3 of your pearls into light, and then your extra stats are gonna be physical damage and crit damage. Now, as far as your empowered gem abilities, you want to have your class gem ability. This is still a mandatory skill on the Shadowhunter, not as much as it was back in the day because your normal attack on Shadowhunter actually received a fairly big buff when the class ended up getting overhauled. But generally speaking, yeah, you still want to end up having the class gem ability. And then other options are going to be Pyro Disc, just because of the movement speed that you'll get from it. And then you could use Explosive Epilogue, but that's not really good for bosses because it only triggers when an enemy dies. So it's really good for dealing with mobs of enemies. But for my money, I'd say this is one of the only classes in the game that you're gonna want to get Volatile Velocity. So the description of this ability reads, increases the shot speed of any projectile. That is 100% false. It turns out that Volatile Velocity basically gives you 40% more range with your shots. Now, that's not very important on most classes, but with the Shadowhunter being able to shoot through walls, it's invaluable, especially when you're doing dungeons that you have completely memorized, or if you're on PC and you have the definitive boss radar mod, it means you know exactly where the boss is, exactly where the chest is. And fun fact, if you're within 45 blocks of a dungeon chest, that's the limit that you can still get the loot out of it. Now, obviously you wouldn't be able to pick up the actual loot of gear, but you would be able to still obtain the gear crafter vaults, for example. Now, the cosmic empowered gem is just going to end up either being Berserk Battler, just to give you light and to give you more damage, or the Vampirium, because not because of the lifesteal, but because of the movement speed that you can get from it. The Fae Trickster is another one of those classes that a lot of people really underestimate. It's kind of a running theme with the game, frankly speaking. There's a couple little tricks that you can do on Fae Trickster that most people don't know about. So similarly to the Neon Ninja, you'll actually regenerate your energy quite fast while you're on the ground. So you can almost indefinitely just keep teleporting. As soon as you go up in the air though, you don't actually regenerate your energy anytime you jump, with a brief cooldown before it starts regenerating. So that makes the Fae Trickster a decent speed farmer, but what about Delves? The class is not the greatest in the Delves simply because you need to not sustain damage for X amount of time in order to get a damage buff. And that's almost impossible to do in the Delves with the sheer amount of enemies that there are. However, Fae Trickster has always been a pretty good single target damage character. Not very good on groups. I mean, decent on groups with your Fae Bomb, but your base attack isn't going to phase through enemies or anything like that. So usually you can only handle one enemy at a time. Even so, they can handle bosses quite well. So as usual, there's a couple different subclasses that you could choose from, but most of all the best ones are always going to end up being lunacy, sort of crazy, just because you'll end up going big every now and then, and that'll end up giving you not only damage, but movement speed is one of the most important reasons why so many players use this. And then there's also going to end up being the Solarion, which the Solarion, the main reason people use it isn't because of the basic attacks have a chance of exploding, dealing damage to enemies, and applying a damage over time effect. That's decent. But the main reason people use it is just because of the light value. You can mix and match. There are other options. I, for one, almost always use the Knight subclass just because the extra movement speed on a mount. And those extra flasks, in my eyes, are more sustained damage over time because of the amount of boost that you'll get from those extra flasks, but it's not mandatory. The stats that you're gonna focus on with your gear is kind of different because this class is so energy dependent. You do want to have energy regen on at least one piece of gear. Ideally, you could have it on your ring and then just forget about it on everything else, but you could also have it on your weapon if you want. And then the other stats you're gonna go for are gonna be crit damage and attack speed. You could sacrifice the crit damage for movement speed if you just absolutely want to focus on dungeons, because then movement speed is one of the most important stats in the game. But with Fae Trickster being a class that most people use as either a boss killer or, you know, in some cases delves just because the damage is really high, then you would just be all attack speed, all crit damage. So I'm gonna go through each of the Fae Trickster's crystal ring effects, just in case you don't know what all of them are. Dance Partner. Fairy Dance summons a Fae Juggernaut that taunts enemies. Mobilize. Fairy Dance summons one large enchanted staff that follows the player. And Trick Trick Boom. When taking damage, the Fae Trickster has a chance to spawn a glitter bomb at its location. This glitter bomb has increased range and stun. Now, it has been a long time since I ended up maining Fae Trickster, so I'm not 100% sure which crystal ring effect is the best one. If I had to guess, it would be the Dance Partner, because having the Fae ally, the Fae Juggernaut, taunt enemies will essentially give you the ability to, well, deal more damage because you won't get knocked out of your passive ability. Or it would end up being Mobilize, maybe, but as far as I recall, the large enchanted staff deals less damage than the three smaller ones. The trade-off is that that staff follows you, but maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe it does deal more damage. Fae mains, sound off in the comments and correct me where I'm wrong. The best banner in slot, of course, is going to end up being the Leviathan torches, or the permanent torch, which you can forge into the enshadowed torch of the Saber Skull, which is the one that gives light, magic damage, flash capacity, but more importantly, movement speed, which for me is always a top priority. For your ally, you actually have a couple different options. There's Orchian, which is for movement speed, Starry Skyfire, just for raw damage because of the cooldown recovery speed. Or you could also use the mini water mana beast, because I've heard that these mysticism allies are actually really, really good because of that crit damage. So Orchian is from the hub, you go over into the Paragon's corner here, and it is a craftable ally that you'll have to have a Paragon's Mark. Now, a Paragon's Mark you can only get out of Paragon Pinatas. How do you get Paragon Pinatas? Basically, every prime Paragon level up to Paragon levels go up to 1,000. Every prime number, you'll end up getting Paragon pins. Starry Skyfire is going to be obtained in the Grand Orrery. So over here in the hub, there's going to end up being the skill tree. And you're going to have to advance down the skill tree to this node right here. And for the Mystic Mana Beast, you're going to come from the hub and go down into the fishing location to the Mysticism guy right here. It's all the way at the bottom with the collectibles, which you have to have the profession maxed out as far as I recall. And then otherwise it's just getting water mana and then water gem dust. Moving on to the skill tree, the main stats that you're going to focus on is the life leech, which will essentially make every character in the game invincible. The movement speed nodes, which I deem as one of the most important in the game. The light nodes, which arguably are more important. and the damage nodes. These are the nodes for the crit damage, and this is the tree that you'll go down in order to end up getting the magic damage, but I personally have my account built towards physical damage. So as far as your flasks are concerned, these are pretty much all the best flasks in the game. Granted, Conjurer's Crucible is going to be the one that most people recommend just because it has a chance of recovering a charge after you trigger Magic Find, which means that you can essentially farm forever without having to get a flask, so long as you have the Magic Find. But for me, I'm lazy. I always just use Death Defying, especially because enemies at the end game kind of hurt. Now, granted, because of the life leech out of the skill tree, we are almost invincible so long as you're outputting damage fast enough. The emblems, you're gonna kind of be stuck with the Arcane Emblem no matter what. And at first, you'll be using Sure Strike until you get your crit damage high enough. You could use Unyielding just because of that precious invulnerability frames, or you could end up using Trailblazing if you're trying to speed farm, and Chromatic if you're trying to deal raw damage because you're basically going to just alt spam. The mid-game stats that you want to end up focusing on is at least 80k magic damage, 800% crit damage and up, and 50 to 60% crit hit and up. Ideally, you're trying to get your crit hit to 100%, and you want to try and strike a nice balance between your raw magic damage and your crit damage. Now, before we move on to the next step, which is going to end up being gems, I want to be very clear because so many of you always talk about how do I end up making myself more powerful? How do I get more PR? And usually the first question that I ask is, are you level 30? In which case most of you say no. So getting your character to level 30 should always be your top priority before you even bother focusing on gems, stats, and gear. Also, the gems that I'm going to be showing you today are not 100% coefficient. It doesn't really matter that much because the damage is almost moot. It's just like 1,000 extra damage or something like that. But my point is, some naysayers might say, oh, you know, that's not 100% the best build, and that's fine. This video is about making it as digestible as possible for you guys. So my main perfect set of gems is on my Shadow Hunter. So just take all the physical damage and swap that to magic damage. You want to have 3 of your lesser gems be 2 pearls magic damage, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearls crit hit, until you get your crit hit to 100%, and then you can cycle crit hit off of your gems into max health. Meanwhile, the other 3 lesser gems are going to be 2 pearls crit damage, 1 pearl magic damage, and no pearls crit hit. You don't have to follow this to the letter. Some of your gems can have 3 pearls in crit damage and no pearls in anything else, or 3 pearls in magic damage. It doesn't really matter that much. You just kind of, again, want to strike a nice balance between it. Empowered gems are going to be as simple as 2 pearls magic damage, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearls crit hit, with all of the cosmic gems, whether it be the lesser or the empowered, being 3 pearls into light. I lost my voice for a second. Also, you might hear the term of boosts instead of pearls. I don't know why. I always call them pearls just because it looks like a pearl of wisdom. For your empowered gem abilities, you do want to end up having Fago My Ego. The classroom ability makes it so that Ego Blast now requires an additional hit of damage to remove the bonus of your damage effect, which if you don't know, the passive is that if the Fae Trickster takes no damage for 4 seconds, their base attack deals bonus damage. This is why Cubic Curtain can be a really good gem for you because avoiding damage grants a protective shield, absorbing the next attack and stunning the attacker. And then your last empowered gem is kind of up to you. I would recommend Pyro Disc just because of the movement speed, but you could cycle it to other stuff if you really want. Volatile Velocity in particular will actually increase your range by 40%, which could be good for sniping as the Fae Trickster, but usually there's like walls in the way anyway, so it doesn't matter. And the Cosmic Gem is going to end up being either Berserk Battler for damage, Vampirium for speed. The Candy Barb is actually one of the better starting classes in the whole game. His hits pack a punch, and on top of that, he's also got really good crowd control. He ends up being a good class for speed farming because of his Crystal Ring ability, and then on top of that, he can also handle delves quite well. One of the big reasons that you'll see at least one Candy Barb usually around the end game though, is because his ultimate ability will end up giving attack speed to all nearby classes. It's not really something that's super important for those of you watching this video, but for the most part, I'm just trying to get the point across that Candy Barb has utility as well as function. So subclass abilities are kind of unanimously always going to end up being the same. You'll probably want to go for Sorta Crazy, the Lunar Lancer subclass, because basically when that randomly triggers, you'll go big and you'll deal a lot more damage, have a lot more attack speed, so on and so forth. The passive ability also gives you some extra physical damage. I like using Knight subclass ability just because the mount movement speed and the extra flask capacity does give me longer survivability and a pretty significant amount of extra damage. But Solarion is also going to end up being one of the best in the game just because of that extra light value you get out of it. Now for your gear stat priority, you're going to focus on attack speed. You want to get your attack speed as close to 300% as possible because that's the soft cap. Anything above that is just visual. It doesn't change anything function wise, but movement speed would be if you're just trying to speed farm, crit damage instead of movement speed if you need to have that extra damage on the class. In most cases, I would say movement speed would be ideal, save for if you're on PC or soon consoles, hopefully the newest difficulty, U12/U15 as we're calling it, does beg the question of movement speed, is it still valuable? In most cases, not really. The reason being that you need to have as much damage as possible, but I don't know whether or not people would want to main the Barb when it comes to doing U15 difficulty. Now, there are the 3 different Crystal Ring abilities, but the only one that you're going to be focusing on is Spin to Win, which it says reduces the energy cost of Swirl Wind and removes the movement speed reduction. It also seems to give you a movement speed boost, or maybe it's just because of the way that the game's coded, it just makes you move a lot faster instead of reducing movement speed. It's actually like increasing your movement speed to compensate for that reduction. I'm not sure how it works. I just know you zoom when you have Spin to Win active. Best banner and slot, in my opinion, is always going to end up being the Leviathan torches, and the permatorch that I use is the Knotted Shadow one. Your best ally and slot in most cases is going to end up being Scorpius because it'll end up giving you the physical damage, the light, and the movement speed. But if you can actually manage to get it, I don't have it yet, the mini Fire Beast is going to give you a little bit more bang for your buck in terms of your damage. So for Scorpius, you're going to come to the hub, go over here to the Grand Orrery, and it's going to end up being located here on this node. Meanwhile, the mini Fire Beast is going to be underground here, where the Mystic Arts are, and this crafting table all the way in the collections is going to be right here and cost various resources. Now, looking at the overall skill tree, there's going to end up being a few nodes that you want to specifically focus on. My recommendation would be the Life Leech node, the Movement Speed node, the Light nodes, and the Damage nodes. I also gave you some nice color coding, so you can always just take a screenshot of this. Now, for your flasks, these are pretty much going to be the best flasks in the game. You can kind of just pick your poison at this point. I always just use Death Defying because everything hits so hard that you usually get one shot regardless. But at the end game, you will have a pretty decent amount of extra max health. So Death Defying isn't always the big one that everybody else suggests. I'm just giving my own personal opinion. Otherwise, in most cases, people will say Conjurer's Crucible Vial because it can end up refilling the flask as you trigger Magic Find if you have a high enough Magic Find. As for the emblems, those are going to change, except for Martial Emblem. The reason why Martial Emblem and even Arcane Emblem are invaluable is because now that we've slowly gotten more and more endgame areas added into the game where the enemies are just so ridiculously tanky, there's no reason to ever get rid of these because of the raw damage it supplies. Other options would be Trailblazing if you're trying to do speed farming, Unyielding if you need that extra bit of survivability, or Chromatic Emblem if you're struggling to use your ult more often to boost up your teammates. Sure Strike, I should also mention, is going to end up being one of the best ones early on until you end up having your crit hit at around 100%. Speaking of stats, your mid-game stats should be aimed at 80,000 physical damage, 50 to 60% crit hit, and 800% crit damage. Obviously, you want to have a lot more than that moving forward, but crit hit in particular, you want to get to 100% and then try to kind of keep your physical damage and your crit damage in line. You don't really need to, as I'll explain momentarily. Before we move on to gems, as always, I do gotta mention, are you level 30? That's the big question I always gotta ask you guys, because so many times I got people asking me, how do I increase my PR? And then they're not even max level. max level needs to be your priority before you even think about focusing on gems and power rank. I also don't have max coefficiency, and frankly speaking, I don't care. That's not what this video is about. I'm trying to make this as digestible to you guys as possible. Now, for the sake of my gems, I have all of them on my Boomeranger, so I've swapped to my Boomer, and I also, again, because I want this to be very, very readable for you guys, I'm going to end up going by a 3x3 for your lesser gems. So you're gonna have 3 of your lesser gems with 2 pearls crit damage, 1 pearl physical, no pearl crit hit, with the other 3 lesser gems being 2 pearls physical damage, 1 pearl crit damage, and no pearls into crit hit, up until you get to 100% crit hit, and then you can cycle crit hit off of your gems in favor of max health. If you have some gems that have 3 pearls in crit damage or physical damage, again, it doesn't really matter that much. You're just trying to have kind of a nice balance between them. But if you notice that you're like significantly weaker than you should be, well, frankly speaking, you might need to change your gems up a bit. As for your empowered gems, those are going to end up being 2 pearls physical, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearls crit hit. As for the elemental gem ability, Pyro Disc is a must just because the movement speed. For your third gem though, it's kind of up to you. Spirit Surge I've heard is good, but I don't really have that much experience with it. Cubic Curtain can be really helpful just because it'll give you a lot more survivability, but again, it's not super important what that third gem is. Moving on to your Cosmic Gems. Those are going to have all pearls in the light stat, with the next stats being no pearls into physical damage and crit damage. And then for the Cosmic Empowered Gem, you're going to want to have either Vampiric ability, which will give you a lot more lifesteal, which you don't really need at that point, but more importantly, it'll give you movement speed. Or if you are going to be going into this true end game of U15/U12, then you would use Berserk Battler just because it's going to give you a lot of light. Now, a lot of people already know that Neon Ninja is most definitely one of the fastest classes in the game. This makes it ideal for speed farming. A couple little tricks that you can do is every time you backflip, you'll end up getting a movement speed buff. So a lot of times people will be jumping around and backflipping, making sure that they stay invisible. And if you're just about to run out of jump, you can always do your number 1 ability to dash and make it to the platform. One thing to note is that in Trove, energy doesn't regen so long as you're jumping. So you can actually do this trick where you face backwards and start back flipping while staying on the ground and having enough energy regen that you regenerate your energy faster than you can spend it. To add even more swag, if you want to end up speed farming while you're jumping in the air, you're going to be doing most of it backwards because you're getting the movement speed as well as the backflip animation. One last quick tip is that Neon Ninja is one of the only characters where attack speed actually affects bomb throw speed. Now, for the subclass ability, there's a couple options, namely Lunar Lancer is probably going to be the best one because when you end up going big mode, you do end up getting a significant movement speed buff. Bard can also be a decent one just because of the movement speed song that can trigger, but it's pretty weird in how they trigger. And then otherwise, the safest bet is just going to end up being Solarion, strictly because of that light value being very, very valuable. You could also use the Knight subclass ability strictly to get that extra flask capacity, which can be very valuable, but I'll talk more about that later. Now, because Neon Ninja thrives at being a speed farmer, it means that the stats you're going to prioritize on your gear is, simply put, going to be movement speed and attack speed. The only instance where you might want to swap movement speed off for crit damage would just be if you're trying to do the delves, in which case I don't know why you would be doing that with the Neon Ninja. I do want to mention that the Neon Ninja is secretly pretty decent at boss fighting. You just got to make sure that you use your ultimate ability because it scales a lot better than it used to years ago. Now, there's a couple different crystal ring effects. All of them have their benefits as well as weaknesses. Clone Jutsu makes it so that the clone created from your backflip will explode at the end of its duration, which can end up being some good stacking damage, but I don't know, it's not that big a deal. Float Like a Butterfly gives you slow fall for the duration of your ultimate ability, which can actually be very, very helpful for speed farming because it means that you won't have to jump a lot. And fun fact is the way that energy regen works in Trove is so long as you're jumping, you're kind of refreshing the internal cooldown before your energy can regenerate, which is why in most cases you just gotta stop jumping and land on the ground. Now, if you're skillful enough with the slow fall effect, you can actually time it very, very perfectly so that you will jump in the air, have the slow fall effect last a long enough period of time that your energy starts coming up because the game doesn't think you're jumping anymore, but you're technically still in the air. The best banner in slot, of course, is going to end up being the torches from Leviathans, as well as the permatorch. I personally always go for the enshadowed Torch of Knotted Shadow because it'll give you the physical boost as well as movement speed. For your ally, there's a lot of different options, but frankly speaking, Scorpius is where it's at just because this class is all about movement speed. You can use Raptor Berserker for early on if you don't end up having Scorpius out of the star chart, but anything that gives you movement speed. Scorpius is located over here in the hub in the Astrolabe and gotten right here on the skill tree. Now, speaking of the skill tree, it's going to be pretty much the same as it would be with any class. You're going to want to prioritize the lifesteal, movement speed, the light nodes, and the physical damage / crit damage nodes. Now, your flasks can actually vary on this class. You might be using Death Defying just because it's going to end up being, the most valuable to keeping you alive. But in most cases, I actually like using the Elysian Bandolier strictly because of the emblems that I end up using. But you could end up using Conjurer's Crucible just to get more flasks for triggering Magic Find. And Vial of Unleashed Power, if you have the right Crystal Ring effect, could kind of work with this class just because it's going to trigger your flask, like your emblem effects anytime you use your ult. It's not ideal because you would have to swap a lot of your stuff around to have cooldown reduction, but I'm just saying it can work. Now for the emblems themselves, Martial Emblem is going to be a must just because everything takes so long to die in this game, especially at the end game, that you're going to need as much damage as possible. And for your other emblem, that's where things get a little bit tricky. So first and foremost, you would end up most likely using Sure Strike just to get your crit rate up enough that it would end up dealing damage that you want. You can use the Chromatic Emblem in the case that you need to have your ult up as often as possible, but in most cases, you would actually use the Zealous Emblem. This will make it so that you restore all of your energy anytime you consume a flask, which is why I like using the most flasks possible. Now, as for the mid-game stats you're going to be focusing on, it's pretty much across the board the same as every other class. So you're going to want to have 80,000 physical damage, 50 to 60% crit hit, obviously trying to get that to 100% as soon as possible, and 800 crit damage. This again is just a suggestion for the mid-game, and then you kind of just bring all of your stats up from there. Speaking of stats, before we end up moving into the gems, I gotta mention as always that you need to prioritize making your character max level, which is level 30. Lots of people are always asking me, how can I make myself stronger? Not realizing that by having a class max level, you'll be able to equip all of your gems, which gives you the highest power boost. Also, before we get into my gem stats, these are not ideal. I do not focus on coefficiency because I'm trying to make these videos as digestible as possible, and it doesn't make that much of a difference when it comes to the end game. So I'm actually gonna be swapping to my Boomer because that's where I have all my physical gems at the moment. So again, to make this as digestible as possible, you're gonna have your lesser gems be 3 the same stats and then another 3 the same stats. So the first 3 gems are going to end up being 2 pearls physical damage, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearls crit hit, up until 100% crit hit, and then you can just swap that out for max health. Whereas the other 3 lesser gems are going to end up being 2 pearls crit damage, 1 pearl crit hit, no pearls crit hit. If you have some gems that have like 3 pearls physical or 3 pearls crit, like this is where it doesn't really matter that much because otherwise you're gonna be wasting way too many resources trying to recycle those. And I pretty much have all 3 of my empowered gems with 2 boost physical, 1 boost crit damage, and no boost to crit hit. As for the cosmic gem boosts, those are all going to be the same across the board, including the empowered gem, which is 3 pearls into light, and then the extra stats are going to be physical damage and crit damage. Now, as far as empowered gem abilities, you definitely want to have your class gem ability on the Neon Ninja because it'll make the shuriken that you throw have a larger, wider area, and it also pierces through enemies and will stun them. Pyro Disc is an absolute must because of the movement speed boost that you'll get from it. And the last gem is kind of just a pick your poison type of situation. In most cases, I would probably go for Cubic Curtain just because it'll give you that extra survivability, but I don't actually have a high level Cubic Curtain, so yeah. And then the Cosmic in Power Gem ability is going to be Vampirium because that's going to end up giving you movement speed. Gunslinger is one of the classes that is all around considered garbage. Okay, jokes aside, guys, Gunslinger did end up having a rework, but it wasn't a good enough rework to bring the class up to snuff with the rest of the classes. I'm gonna break the fourth wall a little bit here with this tutorial just to say that Gunslinger was one of the strongest classes in the game, and then they started to rework all the other classes, bringing them up to the same quality as Gunslinger, and then Gunslinger slowly got overshadowed. And then eventually, when it was finally time to give the Gunslinger its own rework and bring it up to the same quality as everybody else, it kind of got shafted. All they really did was just up a bunch of its damage numbers and not nearly enough to make it worthwhile. I'm not gonna say that you can't use the class, it's just kind of unanimously not recommended, but you should main whatever character you enjoy regardless of that. Moving on, the subclasses that you would want to pick with Gunslinger more than likely would end up just being sort of crazy. Lunar Lancer subclass ability. You can always use Solarion just because of the light value you'll get out of it. Knight can be okay just because you don't have much movement speed on this class, and having the extra mount movement speed can be very, very valuable to you. I've also heard from some people that the Bard subclass ability will give you a pretty decent movement speed boost, but all in all, I think Sorta Crazy is just kind of the one that triggers the most consistently. For your gear stat priority, you have two options. If you're trying to use the Gunslinger just for dungeon farming and whatever, you're gonna go for movement speed and attack speed. But if you're trying to focus on bosses, you don't need to have that movement speed. Bosses being Leviathans, Delve bosses and stuff. So you don't need to have the movement speed to travel from dungeon to dungeon. So you would swap movement speed out for crit damage instead, so that you have more raw damage to actually destroy the bosses. You have to have attack speed on your character no matter what though. Now, as for the Crystal Ring effect, there's a couple different options you have with Gunslinger. Berserk Slinger makes it so that when you run and gun, which is your alt, you gain Berserk, increasing damage and attack speed, but greatly reduces movement speed. In most cases, this is going to end up being your best option. There's also Lock and Load, which dodging gives an instant charged shot, resets after a short cooldown, kind of worthless, and Stunning Ammo makes it so that charged shots have a chance to stun. So I think it's pretty obvious that you would just go with Berserk Slinger. As for the banner, you're just gonna use any of the torches from Leviathans. The permatorch that I use for my magic characters is going to end up being the Saber Skull one, just because it has that movement speed, blast capacity, magic damage, light value. There are other options that you could craft, but for my money, this is the best one because you're gonna need all the movement speed that you can possibly get, just because this class has a very, very low base movement speed if you're using it for dungeons and not bosses. For your ally, you do technically have a couple options, like the Mini Water Mana Beast has like a lot of damage, but generally speaking, the only one we're going to talk about today is Starry Skyfire, just because it's going to end up giving you that extra cooldown recovery, because all of the damage of the Gunslinger, unfortunately, is tied to its ultimate ability. Starry Skyfire, of course, being obtained over here at the skill tree, and you're gonna kind of end up getting this guy anyway because you need this light stat, but we'll get into that in a minute. Orchian would be an okay one, again, if you're just trying to use this as a speed farmer because of that movement speed boost. And Orchian, of course, being a Paragon ally that you could craft right here. So yeah, speaking of the skill tree, you're going to end up going for the Life Leech node, the movement speed nodes, at least in my opinion, these are highly valuable, the light nodes, and the damage nodes, of course, focusing on the magic damage skill tree rather than the physical that I have. So now let's talk about your flask options. In most cases, I always just use Death Defying because I'm lazy and I like farming without having to think about anything. However, you could end up using Conjurer's Crucible if you're farming dungeons, just because in this regard, you'll end up actually usually obtaining a lot more flask back whenever Magic Find triggers. But another option is the Elysian Bandolier, just because once again, you're going to be focusing a lot on the cooldown. Like the Gunslinger is still pretty decent at burst damage. The problem is that you'll run out of flasks very quickly just because you're gonna be spamming your ult so much when you're fighting a boss. Now, as for the emblem, unfortunately for all of us, enemies are just so high scaled now that Arcane Emblem is a must. You can never swap it out. But for your secondary emblem, you have a couple different options. You could end up using Sure Strike if you need that extra crit damage or crit percentage, sorry. And then you can eventually swap that out for Chromatic Emblem if you're fighting Leviathans and bosses because you need that cooldown, or Trailblazing if you're just trying to speed farm. The mid-game stat goal that you're gonna be aiming for is around 80k magic damage, 60% and up of crit hit, trying to get that to 100% as soon as possible, and then 800% crit damage. This is again just a ballpark mid-game. Anything higher than that is obviously going to be great. Now, before we get into gem stats, I do got to mention a couple things. One, you gotta max out your character first. Before you even get to the point of looking at the gems and figuring out what stats to prioritize, you gotta get your class to level 30, man. I have too many times people ask, like, how can I make my PR better? And they're not even max level, because at max level, you'll be able to equip all of the gems in the first place, and they give you a huge power boost. I also do not build my characters for coefficiency. I wanted to elaborate on this in this video, because the reason why most of my characters aren't coefficient is because every class is not created equal. And so if you want to end up being the most coefficient with one laser focused class, it means that you, in a way, have to have your stats set up very, very specifically. So with that, I actually have my gems set up in such a way that I can swap them out to any class in the game and pretty much be able to handle anything. Eventually, I might end up making like a coefficiency guide or something when somebody ends up explaining to me every single nuance of all of the classes. But it's quite a headache to get involved with all of that. And so I opt into having these videos more digestible for you. So I do got to swap to my Draco to show you guys my stat priority. 3 of my lesser gems are going to end up being 2 pearls magic, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearls crit hit, or boosts. You'll hear other people refer it as. And then the other 3 elemental gems are going to end up being 2 boosts crit damage, 1 boost magic damage, no boost crit hit. The empowered gems, on the other hand, are going to end up being 2 boost magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. Of course, once you end up getting to 100% crit hit, you can cycle crit hit off of your gems for max health. And the cosmic gems fall under their own category because all of them, including like the lesser and empowered gems, you're going to have every boost into the light stat, with the additional stats being magic damage and crit damage. Now, as far as your empowered gem ability, obviously you need to have the class gem ability for the Gunslinger. It kind of makes the class. You can actually get away with not using the class gem ability, but generally speaking, it's a bad idea. Explosive Epilogue is a good option. And then for your 3rd elemental gem, honestly, it's kind of up to you. Cubit Curtain Pin be a good one. Pyrodisc is also a really good one, just in terms of movement speed. And for the Cosmic and Power Gem, in most cases, you would just go for Berserk Battler. You can use Vampirium for the movement speed, but if you have the Life Leech node out of the skill tree, then you won't need the Life Leech out of Vampirium, which is why Berserk Battler is usually the best bet, because it just gives you more raw damage. I'm a little bit surprised how often I say this, but Draco is yet another class that gets extremely underestimated by players. See, the class is extremely tanky, but it also has this passive buff where when you touch lava, you get a movement speed boost, which is very, very helpful in fire worlds. The crazy thing is, if you end up having all of your movement speed buffs trigger at the same time as touching the lava, you can end up being one of the fastest classes in the game. Granted, you have to have lava nearby in order to have that trigger. But because of how tanky Draco is, it's a very, very good class for deep delves and boss fighting. But even with the whole little lava speed trick, it's not necessarily a very good class for speed farming. So subclass ability is going to end up being kind of just the same as every other class. I would recommend using Solarion if you can, just because the extra light value, as always, is going to be invaluable. But otherwise, sort of crazy. Lunar Lancer's ability is pretty good, just because anytime you end up getting the Giganto mode to trigger, you'll end up gaining movement speed as well as just more damage. I like using mounted cavalry, not because of the mount movement speed per se, but most of all the flask capacity, though the mount movement speed is very useful because the class doesn't have a very high base movement speed, so you are going to be fairly reliant on your mount. Stat priority you're going to focus on for all of your gear is going to, of course, be movement speed and crit damage. Because the class is not actually affected by attack speed, it means that you don't need to focus on getting it on the class, which means you can have optimal damage with the crit damage, but you can also just have that movement speed to help out. For Draco's Crystal Ring effect, there's going to be Dragon Force, which summons 2 Draco allies when using the ultimate ability. However, keep in mind that you can only have 6 babies at a time. It's just kind of the hard cap that the game gives you. Firestorm, which makes it so that your Spitfire, your right click, grants a buff that allows it to be freely used for a short time. That can be really good burst damage. But then also Dragonborn makes it so that when dodging, the Draco leaves behind a burnt offering, which is probably one of the worst options just because you're kind of, what you're bottlenecked for your damage with the Draco is waiting for the animation of your character throwing the pot on the ground and then, of course, destroying it. So you could either use Dragon Force just because that'll get you to the most optimal damage quicker by having all of your babies and your ultimate at the same time, or you could go for Firestorm just because it will allow you to have a burst of damage for a very short time. If I'm being perfectly honest, this class doesn't have very good Crystal Ring effects. And I'm sure somebody who mains the Draco more than me, and more particularly who actually uses the Crystal Ring effects, can sound off in the comments and correct me. Now for the best banner and slot, generally speaking, it's going to be the Leviathan torches, the Permatorch obviously being the best, and I always craft it into the Saber Skull, just because it's the one that gives you not only the movement speed, but light, magic damage, and flask capacity. Keeping in mind, if you do have a Permatorch and you do forge it into another torch, you can always loot collect the torch and you'll get your Permatorch back. You just won't get the resources that you spent to upgrade it. Now you got 2 options for your best ally and slot. One is going to end up being the Mini Water Mana Beast, because this is going to give you just an outright abundance of extra damage, which from the hub is located down here in the basement where we've got the Mysticism Profession. And down in the collectibles, there's going to end up being the Water Beast right here for these resources. But for my money, I would go for Starry Skyfire because it's going to end up giving you that increased cooldown recovery speed, and a lot of the damage of the Draco hinges upon the ultimate ability, which from the hub is located over here at the star chart and is going to end up being this node right here, which you're going to have to get anyways because of the light. Speaking of the star chart, the nodes that you're going to be focusing on is the Life Leech node, which is going to make pretty much every class in the game almost invincible, the movement speed nodes, the light node, and the damage nodes, keeping in mind that I have my characters built towards physical, but you would go towards magic. Now for your flask option, pretty much any of these will end up working good for you, but generally speaking, I always like using Death Defying because I'm lazy and pretty much anything at the end game will almost certainly one-shot me. But since you're Draco, and Draco is a tanky boy, you could use Elysian Bandolier just to give you more flask capacity. Conjurer's Crucible because it'll trigger every time Magic Find triggers. Valorous is okay, but generally speaking, those are going to be the best options. As for the Flask Emblem, unfortunately, because of how tanky the endgame enemies are in the game right now, you're gonna pretty much always be stuck using Arcane Emblem. You can't really swap it off at any point anymore. There was a point in time where we could swap off of it once upon a time, but that's irrelevant now. For your secondary Flask Emblem, though, you would end up using Sure Strike Emblem earlier on just because you need to have that extra crit chance. But as soon as you get your crit chance high enough, you could swap that out for Chromatic Emblem is probably going to be your best bet because once again, all of your damage is going to hinge upon the ultimate ability and all of your little Draco babies and stuff. But if you need survivability, which shouldn't happen much if you have the Life Leech node on your Draco, is going to be Unyielding Emblem, or if you're absolutely dedicated to using this one main class for just speed farming, then you're gonna wanna have Trailblazing. For mid-game stats, and keep in mind that this is just kind of a ballpark estimate where you wanna aim for and then move up from there, you're gonna wanna have 80,000 magic damage, 50 to 60% crit hit, and 700 to 800% crit damage. Again, this is just for like kind of a midpoint, and then you would just work up. Now, before we get into the gems, there's 2 things that I gotta bring up. One, Are you level 30? Because so many people are always wondering, how can I make my character stronger? And then they don't even realize that they're not max level. Max level makes a huge difference because it'll allow you to equip gems to every single one of your slots, and gems gives you the most stats and PR in the game. On top of that, I am not doing a super coefficient video. As you can see, totally not a glitch at all. I'm at 0 coefficiency. But no, I want to make these videos as digestible as possible to you guys. I'll have a coefficiency guides like a little further down the line. So let's move on to the gems. We're first of all going to be talking about the colored lesser gems, not including cosmic. Those are their own category, but we're going to try and get 2 boosts magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit, and you're gonna do that on 3 of your colored lesser gems, and then the other 3 lesser gems are going to end up being 2 boosts crit damage, 1 boost magic damage, no boost crit hit. Whereas your empowered gems, you're going to aim for 2 boost magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And of course, as I mentioned, all of the cosmic gems, including the empowered, is just going to be all 3 boosts into light, with the additional stats being crit damage and magic damage. Keep in mind, once you get 100% crit hit, you can swap crit hit off of the gems for max health. As far as the empowered gem abilities, you definitely want to have the class gem ability. That's pretty much mandatory. And then you can use Pyro Disc for movement speed, Cubic Curtain for survivability if you want. I don't think Explosive Epilogue works on this class. Maybe it does, and maybe I'm just confused. The description is still pretty bogus after all these years. But otherwise, Spirit Surge can end up being okay as well, just because it's kind of a damage over time thing, and Draco's Flame is kind of damage over time. But generally speaking, we already know what the best gems are. And the Cosmic Empowered Gem, you're going to be going for either Vampirium if you're earlier on and need survivability, because it's going to give you life leech, but it also gives you a movement speed boost. But when you get more towards the later portion of the game, you're going to be using Berserk Battler, because it's basically going to boost up your light stat while you're fighting, which makes you deal more damage. It's no surprise that a lot of players consider the Boomeranger to be one of the strongest characters in the game, if not the strongest character in the game. In my personal opinion, that's not necessarily the case, but I will say that the Boomeranger does have an insane amount of damage and is really, really good at delves, bosses, and can also be pretty decent at speed farming, although not very fast. Suffice to say that a lot of players are migrating over to the Boomeranger for the new 5-star dungeons in the Rising Tide update, just because a lot of the other classes simply don't have the sheer amount of damage that this class does. While there are multiple subclass abilities, usually in most cases people are going to use the Solarion subclass ability just because of that extra light value, but Sort of Crazy, obviously a great one, just because of the physical damage bonus you'll get, and anytime the lunar form triggers and you go big mode, you'll deal lots and lots of damage. Bard Song can also be a decent subclass ability, but usually for my money, I always go with the Knight subclass ability simply because of the extra flash, but also the mount movement speed is really useful, especially on a class like this that doesn't end up having very good movement speed in comparison to others. Your gear stat priority on this class should be one of 2 options depending on how you want to play. If you're dealing with bosses, and more particularly the new 5-star dungeons in the Long Shade, you're going to want to have nothing but damage, so attack speed and crit damage. But if you're trying to speed farm, just because you absolutely want to use this character no matter what, you would just simply swap that crit damage for movement speed instead. The Boomeranger's Crystal Ring effects will vastly change which weapon you want to use on the character. Blast Bow is one of the best, wherein it triggers an explosive effect on each bow attack, which can be really, really good for just heaps and heaps of damage. But Cyclone can be really good for melee characters because every 3rd melee attack will pull enemies in. And that's one of the biggest problems with the new 5-star dungeons, is that the enemies are so tanky that they just slowly kind of separate around the field. So the Cyclone ability can be very useful for that. But the Overstuffed Urn is kind of a unanimous winner if you want to just swap between either, because it's going to make your Urn trigger additional effects, and the Urn can be heaps and heaps of damage, with the additional effect being more chance of triggering the highest damage abilities of the Urn. The best banner in slot is obviously just going to end up being the torches from Leviathans, including the Permatorch. The one I always end up using is the one that gives you physical damage as as well as movement speed, because movement speed is really, really important to me. If at any point you end up crafting a permatorch and you don't really like it, you can loot collect this and it'll give you the permatorch back, but it won't give you the resources back that are required to craft it into the next type of torch. As for your ally, you have a couple options. Scorpius is going to be kind of the standard one that everyone's going to use. So from here in the hub, if you go up here, excuse my frame rate, I don't know what's happening. This is going to be the Grand Orrery. Scorpius is going to be this node right here, which you kind of have to have anyways because of the light value. But the mini fire beast out of the Mystic Arts is also going to be incredibly powerful. So coming from the hub right over here in the crafter's corner, there's going to end up being the Mystic Arts down here. And all the way at the bottom is going to end up being the fire beast that you can craft. Now moving on to the skill tree, there's going to be a few specific abilities I would recommend. The Life Leech node, which makes almost every character almost invincible in this game, save for abilities that can kill you through death defying. The movement speed nodes are incredibly important to me, as I mentioned before. The light nodes and the damage nodes. You're gonna want to try and get all the crit damage and get all of the physical damage. As far as your flasks are concerned, these are pretty much the best flasks in the game. I always use Death Defying because I'm lazy, and frankly speaking, the end game enemies just hit so hard, you'll usually die in one hit, but there are new enemies that can just kill you through Death Defying because someone on the dev team doesn't enjoy a fun video game. I'm not saying we should be invincible, I'm just saying that that's not challenging when you get one shot. Conjurer's Crucible is another one people use for long farming sessions just because it has a chance of recovering a charge whenever Magic Find triggers. But moving on to the emblems, you're never going to be able to swap Martial Emblem out anymore, just because frankly speaking, the end game is just that powerful. Maybe early game you could swap it out, but yeah, not really. For your secondary, you can use Trailblazing for speed farming if you need to, or Chromatic so that you can end up having high amounts of damage, because again, all of your damage is going to be with your Urn and your other abilities. But you can also use Sure Strike if you're earlier on in the game and you absolutely need that crit rate. Speaking of crit rate, let's talk about mid-game stat optimization. You're going to want to have 50 to 60% crit hit, maybe 700 to 800% crit damage, and 50 to 60,000 physical damage at its base. This is just something for the mid game that you can aim for. You're trying to kind of strike a nice balance with getting 100% crit hit your top priority early on. And before we end up moving on to the gems, I gotta say this every single time in these videos, get your class to level 30 before you even attempt thinking and theorizing about how you should build your character. So many times people are always asking, what can I do to optimize and get myself higher PR? And then usually they're not even max level. Max level is going to make a huge impact on your character because it allows you to equip all of your gems to all of your different slots, and gems give you the highest damage and stats in the game. Secondly, this video is not focused on the most coefficient build possible. I do have another video that I have planned after we go through all of these classes that's going to focus on that. But coefficiency, generally speaking, is very, very meticulous, because depending on how you have your character built, what stuff you have unlocked is going to completely change the stats that you'll get on your gems. The reason I'm saying this is because I want to make this video as digestible to you as possible. And so I'm going to be very, very forthcoming and very strict with telling you what stats you're going to be focusing on, but you don't have to follow it to the letter. So I'm going to swap over to my Shadow Hunter just while we talk about my gem stats. So for the Empowered gems, pretty much all three of the elemental ones are going to be the exact same, which I would recommend 2 boosts physical damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit until you have 100% crit hit, and then you can cycle crit hit off of some of your gems for max health to give you some survivability. You're pretty much just going to do that for all your empowered colored gems. Cosmic gems are kind of their own category. So for your lesser gems, and you'll have to excuse the boost that I actually have and kind of ignore that and just take my word for it, I like to go a 3/3 ratio. So 3 of your lesser gems are going to be 2 boost physical, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit, while the other 3 are going to be 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost physical, no boost crit hit. I did want to briefly mention that the reason why my boosts don't necessarily reflect the words that I'm saying is because I went to a guide online and I kind of followed it to make my Shadow Hunter more coefficient. And frankly speaking, I didn't notice that much of a difference versus the build that I just mentioned to you guys. And Anyways, moving on, the cosmic gems are all unanimously, the empowered gem and the lesser gems, going to be all boosts light damage and then no boost to crit hit and physical. Now, as far as the abilities that you're focusing on for your empowered gems, obviously Bach Bomb is mandatory, Cubic Curtain if you want survivability, Pyrodisc if you want movement speed, Explosive Epilogue if you use ranged. The cosmic gem, you can go from Vampirium early on just because the lifesteal, but once you get the lifesteal out of the skill tree, it kind of becomes useless. Vampirium does still have a movement speed boost though, but in most cases, you're just gonna want to have Berserk Battler because of the sheer amount of damage that it'll give you. The Tomb Raiser is an absolute powerhouse when it comes to survivability. It's always been one of the best characters for survivability because it's got like some damage reduction skills and such, but it's not really the best in terms of speed farming because of the long amount of time that it takes to have optimal damage. Because basically as you summon your minions, you gotta end up getting their purple health bar in order to end up having them deal optimal damage. That's why this character is more attuned to Delves or Leviathans. Obviously there's a couple different options for your subclass ability, but namely Solarion, Lunar Lancer, maybe Mounted Cavalry, the Knight subclass, just because of the extra flask capacity, gives you a lot more survivability. You're going to be spamming your pots a lot. I don't know. It's not that big a deal which one you end up taking, because again, the Tomb Raiser is going to have huge survivability regardless. For your gear stat priority, you're going to be focusing on crit damage and movement speed because you don't need attack speed at all on this class. The movement speed will make the character handle speed farming at a relative pace, but it's not something super impressive because there's no abilities that boost movement speed. As for the Crystal Ring effect, Banshee Blast makes it so that basic attacks have a chance to summon baby banshees, which is okay. Ghost More reduces the energy drain from Ghost Form, which gives you like 90% damage reduction. You don't need it as much as you would back in the day just because of the skill tree, as we'll talk about later with the Life Leech ability. Skell Biggle, for my money, is going to be your best option because using Bone Tirage has a chance to summon a larger skeleton. When this large skeleton dies, it will spawn Skell-Littles. So that is a way that you can end up ultimately getting your minions to all have purple health bars very, very quickly. But on top of that, it's just the skeleton or the Skell Biggle does a lot more damage. Excuse me if I stumble over my words, I have a massive migraine. The best banner in slot is obviously just going to end up being any of the Leviathan torches. For my money, I always go for the Saber Skull because it gives light, magic damage, and movement speed is always important to me. Fun fact, if you end up crafting the wrong permanent torch, you can always just loot collect it. You'll get the permatorch back, but none of the resources that were required for crafting it up. For your ally, you actually have a couple different options with Tomb Raiser. Orchin, which will give you the magic damage boost, but it'll also give you a movement speed boost when a nearby enemy dies. Orchin is located over here in the hub in the Paragon section and is going to be crafted for various Paragon resources. The Mini Water Mana Beast is going to give you just heaps and heaps of damage though. And over here in the hub, down in the basement, is going to end up being the Mystic Arts. And this is where you'll end up crafting the Water Mana Beast. Coming up here to the Astrolabe, this is the skill tree. Your tree is going to be slightly different from mine, but one of the mandatory abilities, in my opinion, is going to be the Life Leech node. This makes almost every character invincible, Tomb Raiser even more so. Movement speed nodes, as I mentioned for me, is extremely important. The light nodes and the damage nodes. Of course, speccing your character towards magic damage, whereas my skill tree is towards physical damage. For your flask, pretty much all of these options are going to be your best bet. I always just use Death Defying because I'm really lazy. Back in the day, Vial of Unleashed Power used to be the absolute best for Tomb Raiser, but that was back when Shadow Towers were a thing. So honestly, you can kind of just pick whichever one you want. Conjurer's Crucible is a good one for long-term farming because you'll get your flask back as you trigger Magic Find. And the emblems are going to vary. Unfortunately, at this point in the game, you pretty much always have to have Arcane Emblem. It's just a must because enemies are just always going to be way too powerful. I mean, you can get rid of it in some regard, but usually if you're just focusing on endgame stuff, no. I like using Trailblazing, again, because of movement speed, but you do have a couple other options. You could end up using Unyielding Emblem if you really need survivability, but you shouldn't need much of it on the Tomb Raiser. And then Sure Strike Emblem can be really good to get that extra 20% crit hit that you might be missing early on in the game. The mid-game stats you want to focus on is going to be anywhere between 50 and 80,000 magic damage. Your crit hit you want to have at 50 to 60%, trying your best to get that to 100% as soon as possible, and crit damage anywhere around like 800%. You pretty much have all of those like stats and just slowly build them up. You want to try and have a nice balance between crit damage and, you know, your magic damage. And then otherwise the crit hit, you pretty much, again, just always want to have that at 100%. Before we end up getting into the gems, the two things that I gotta mention is if you're sitting there wondering, well, how can I end up increasing my PR? Get your class to level 30 first, because it'll end up allowing you to equip all of your gems, and that gives you the hugest, like the biggest power boost. And then also this guide is not focusing on coefficiency. I'm trying to make this video as digestible to you guys and gals as possible. And I will have a coefficiency guide later on, but you gotta understand that I swap my gems very regularly. And in order to have a class be the most coefficient possible, you kind of have to set up the gems specifically for that class, because each class is different in the base stats that they have. So for your empowered colored gems, you're gonna be going for 2 boost magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then for your lesser colored gems, it's going to be what I always refer to as a 3x3. You don't have to follow this to the letter. It's just an easy way to remember, where 3 of your colored lesser gems will be the exact same: 2 boost magic, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3 will end up being 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost magic damage, no boost crit hit. Once you get to 100% crit hit, you can just swap crit hit off of your gems and instead put max health, but it's not really that important. The boost on your cosmic gems, whether it be lesser or empowered, is going to be all the same across the board, which is all boosts into light, and then no boost into crit damage and magic damage. As for the empowered gem abilities, you definitely want to end up getting the Beckon Banshee. It makes it so that your number 1 ability will summon a Banshee that will heal your minions, because your minions are just always going to slowly die over time. A couple other options is Pyro Disc for speed farming, Cubic Curtain if you need the survivability, but I don't know. The last gem doesn't really matter too much. You can kind of just pick whatever you want. And for the cosmic gem, that can be Vampirium if you want movement speed, because you don't really need the life steal out of it. But in most cases, you would go for Berserk Battler, because it's going to boost up your light as you fight, which makes you deal heaps and heaps more damage. The Revenant. Yet another class that you would think would not go underestimated, considering how much of an absolute beast it is. I think a lot of people really underestimate Revenant simply because it wasn't very good back in the day. On top of that, it's also a very slow class, so you won't really see people using it for speed farming. But trust me when I say that it's actually really, really good at handling both delves and bosses. The main reason being is that it has an innate ability of lifesteal, so having that with the lifesteal we'll get out of the skill tree, and we'll talk about that later, makes the Revenant a force to be reckoned with. So first of all, what would we use for the subclass ability? Well, it's pretty much gonna be the same as every other character. You can use the Solarion subclass just to have that extra light value, but it also does do a damage over time effect, which can be pretty good. I, in most cases, will use the Knight subclass ability because of the mount movement speed, especially with how slow Revenant can be at its base movement speed, but the extra flash capacity helps too. The Lunar Lancer subclass ability is once again a really, really solid one, just because when you have the lunacy mode trigger, you're gonna get big and you're gonna deal heaps of damage. But don't underestimate some of the other ones. Bard is one that lots of people always advocate just because it can give you decent movement speed, but is pretty random. I would say don't underestimate the Pirate Captain's subclass ability because it can secretly do quite a bit of damage. Now, your gear stat priority on the Revenant is going to be fairly easy to build because you need to have nothing but attack speed and either crit damage when you're fighting bosses and what have you, but But if you absolutely want to use this class for speed farming, you would simply swap the crit damage off of your gear for movement speed. In both cases, you want to have attack speed because your left click is going to be where you get your primary amount of damage. Now, going through the Revenant's crystal ring effects, we've got speed spears, which makes it so that your spirit spears will no longer give you the movement speed penalty. Spirit squad, which has spirit storm summons a group of tiny wraith spirits, and vengeful storm, which makes it so that when at low health, spirit storm is automatically triggered, but it does have an internal cooldown. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, none of these matter that much. If I had to pick one, I guess I would say speed spears, just because that movement speed penalty is pretty bad. But the thing is that in most cases, the only time that you would use your spirit spears is when you're locking in and fighting against like a boss or something. The best banner in slot, and you'll excuse me for swapping my Shadow Hunter, is going to end up being torches from Leviathans, Permatorch being the best, of course. And in my opinion, I always end up using the Enshrouded Knotted Shadow one because it ends up giving you movement speed, and that's something that I highly prioritize on all my characters, regardless of if they're speed farmers or not. Your best ally in slot can either be the Mini Fire Mana Beast, which is going to give you, I think, the highest damage output in the game in terms of an ally. Coming over here from the hub, there's going to end up being this basement down here with all the fishing stuff, and all the way down at the bottom is going to end up being the Fire Mana Beast at the Mystic Arts table. But a super safe, easy one is going to end up being Scorpius. And from the hub over here is the Grand Orrery with the skill tree, and there's Scorpius, which you're gonna inevitably end up getting because of the light stat value. Speaking of the skill tree, it's pretty much unanimously going to end up being the same for everybody. But what I like to prioritize is the life leech node, the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and the damage nodes. In some cases, you can sacrifice the movement speed nodes for a little bit of extra damage, but again, I always prioritize movement speed myself. For your flask options, pretty much any of these are going to be your best bet. I, in most cases, choose Death Defying because everything will one-shot you. But as a Revenant, you should have some significant survivability because when you have your spirit spears down and your basic attack and the life steal that you have out of the skill tree on top of the base life steal of the class, you can get away with the Elysian Bandolier just to have more flasks, because in most cases you won't be using it for healing as much. But you know, it's still kind of a pick your poison situation because you still might end up getting killed. Conjurer's Crucible is also a really good one just because it'll trigger anytime you get Magic Find, you might get more flasks. So people like using that for longevity of farming. And for the emblems, we pretty much are always stuck using Martial at least just because we need to have that raw damage now. But your secondary emblem will vary depending on what point you are in the game. Trailblazing, for example, is really good if you're trying to speed farm with this class. Unyielding emblem, if you absolutely need that survivability, especially in super deep delves. I honestly don't know why I even have Chromatic equipped, but Sure Strike emblem will also be a good one if you're early on in the game and don't have much crit hit. Speaking of crit hit and various other stats, the mid-game stat goal you should be aiming for is anywhere between 50% crit hit and up, crit damage around 800%, and physical damage at, say, 50 to 60, maybe 80%, or 80,000, sorry. Again, this is just kind of a mid ballpark. Like if you notice one of these stats is way too high in comparison to the others, that might be why you're struggling at the mid portion of the game. Later in the game, of course, it's a lot more nuanced. Now, before we end up talking about gems and what have you, I gotta mention, as always, get your class to level 30 first, okay? Because everyone's always like, hey, how do I make my character stronger? I'm at like 15 KPR or whatever. And in most cases, they're never max level. Max level lets you equip all of your gems, which gives you the most significant power boost. I also need to reiterate that these videos are not about the most coefficient classes possible, because when it comes to coefficiency, it gets very, very specific for each individual class because their stats vary ever so slightly. I will have a guide hopefully in the future that focuses on coefficiency, but as of right now, we're just gonna try and make this as digestible as possible. So I'm gonna swap to my Shadow Hunter here, and you don't have to follow these gem stat boosts to the letter. For all of your colored in powered gems, not including the Cosmic Gem, I would go for 2 boost physical, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit until you have 100% crit hit, and then you can cycle any extra crit hit into max health. ignore the boost that I have on my gems and listen to the words, okay? And then for the lesser gems, I like to say, do 3 this way and 3 this way, because there's a total of 6 lesser gems, again, not including the cosmics. So 3 of those lesser gems would be the same as the empowered gems. 2 boost physical, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3 lesser gems would instead be 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost physical, no boost crit hit. If your gem stat boosts slightly vary, it doesn't really matter that much. You're just trying to kind of have a nice balance between the physical damage and crit damage that you have. And every single one of the cosmic gems is going to have all boosts into light with no boost physical and crit damage. As for the empowered gem abilities, honestly speaking, the class gem kind of sucks, because the reason why players don't really utilize the right click or the shield bash with the Revenant is because it's not affected by attack speed, and so it's actually more beneficial to just drop down your spears and then hold left click rather than even bothering throwing your shield down. It's supposed to deal like a damage over time effect, so maybe in some cases you could hit an enemy with a shield and then just go to your left click, but in most cases you don't really need the class gem. You could just get it because it's a free empowered gem. Spirit Surge is an option. You could also use Pyro Disc just because of the movement speed that you get out of it. Cubic Curtain can give you a little bit more survivability if you need. And the Cosmic Gem in most cases is just going to be Berserk Battler just because it's going to increase your light as you damage enemies, so it makes you stronger. The only reason you would maybe use Vampirium, because it does have lifesteal that you don't really need, the only reason you'd use Vampirium is because it does give movement speed. Lunar Lancer is another fantastic speed farmer, even though it's not particularly good in the delves. It's not entirely because the class doesn't have damage, it's most of all because of the lengthy animations of all of your abilities. Like when you do your number 1 ability, you're basically floating in the air doing nothing unless you can grapple down, but sometimes the grappling hook doesn't work because it's Trove. I've also had it before where my character gets completely locked in his animations. But because the grappling hook has so much range, this is what makes this class really, really good when it comes to speed farming. Not only can you reach really high vertical areas without needing any of the jump mounts in the game, but there's a little bit of a tech trick you can do. If you grapple to something and jump last second, you can keep the momentum for a little while. I'd like to point out I'm not even rocking gear with max movement speed right now. So as far as the subclass ability is concerned, it's pretty much just going to be the same old across the board, with Solarion being the one that gives you the most damage because of the light value, but Bard is another one that I've heard people suggest, although I don't particularly like it because it's very random which abilities you'll end up obtaining from it. The one I always go for in most cases is the Knight, just because of the mount movement speed, but in Lunar Lancer's case, your movement speed is so ridiculously high, you don't really need it. Although I do still take it just because of the extra flask capacity, because that's going to be able to trigger trailblazing and such. As far as your gear stat priority, it depends how you want to play this character. In most cases, you would just go for movement speed and attack speed, because your base attack is, for the most part, going to be where you're going to deal a lot of your damage just because of how broken the other abilities can be. I don't mean broken in a good way, I mean they barely function. But if you absolutely want to try and use this class in, say, the delves or even at the end game, you would simply swap the movement speed off for crit damage. Now, for the Lunar Lancer's Crystal Ring effects, you have From the Moon. When in lunar form, basic attacks have a chance to spawn meteors from the sky, which is good for additional damage if you want to be all about damage. Cliffhanger, dodging lowers the cooldown of the grappling and the empowered grapple. This ability also has its own internal short cooldown. And lastly, Need for Speed. After using the buffed grapple, gain a speed buff instead of an attack buff. For my money, the Need for Speed is where the Lunar Lancer shines, because this is one of the fastest classes in the game. The best banner in slot is going to end up being the Torches from Leviathans, with the Permatorch being the best one, and I always craft the Knotted Shadow one because of that extra movement speed it gives. Now, you do have a couple different options for allies. The Mini Fire Mana Beast is going to be your best option in terms of raw damage. So starting from the hub, you would go down here into the fishing area, and the Mystic Arts table is going to be right here. All the way down at the bottom is going to be where you craft the Fire Beast, which I still don't have yet. But Scorpius is going to be the best in most cases just because of that movement speed. So from the hub coming over here is going to end up being the Grand Orrery, and over here is going to be Scorpius, which in most cases you'll just naturally get because you need that light node anyways. Speaking of the skill tree, you're gonna start out with the life leech node, which is gonna make you almost invincible with every class in the game. The movement speed nodes, I prioritize very, very much. The light nodes and the damage nodes. As far as your flask is concerned, these are pretty much the best options in the game. Use whichever one you want. I personally use Death Defying just because survivability is important to me. Most of all, it's because I'm lazy and I don't want to have to flask when I get low health. But otherwise, Conjurer's Crucible is a good one just because it'll restore as you trigger Magic Find, which if you have high enough Magic Find can be really, really good for long-term farming. The Elysium Bandolier is also a good one if you just absolutely need to spam your emblems. Speaking of your emblems, unfortunately, you'll never be able to get rid of Martial Emblem just because of the way that Trove is right now, unless you're like super end game and you go down a couple biomes. So in most cases, you would always have this. With your secondary emblem, I would use Trailblazing just because of the movement speed. Again, that's what I would prioritize on Lunar Lancer. But some other really good ones would be Unyielding Emblem just for survivability, gives you a little bit more tankiness. Sure Strike's also a really good one if you have low crit hit. The mid-game stat goal that you should be focusing on is around 80k physical damage, 800% crit damage, and 50 to 60% crit hit. You're trying to move up from there, and in most cases you want to try and prioritize getting your crit hit to 100% first. That said, I wouldn't worry too much about like specifying where your stats should be at, just because once you get to the end game, your stats are going to kind of even out anyway. Now, before we end up getting into my gems, I do gotta mention, as always, are you level 30? That's the main thing that I always see. People always asking, how do I increase my power rank and so on and so forth. Bro, you gotta be level 30 so that you can equip all of your gems, because your gems are gonna give you the most power. This is also not a video for coefficiency. I'm trying to make these as digestible as possible, and coefficiency is very, very different for each different class because each class has their own varying stats. So if you'll pardon me, I'm gonna swap to my Shadow Hunter while we look at my gems here. For your 3 colored empowered gems, because cosmic gems are their own category, I would focus on getting 2 boosts physical damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. Try to understand the words that are coming out of my mouth rather than the visual indicator, because I've been swapping my gem boosters around a lot on my Shadow Hunter. And again, so that this video is easy to understand, you're going to have 3 of your lesser gems be the exact same. So 2 boost physical, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3 colored gems will be 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost physical, no boost crit hit. Of course, once you get to 100% crit hit, you can swap crit hit off to max health. And your cosmic gems, well, all 3 of them are gonna be the same. You want every single boost that you can get into light, and then the additional stats will be crit damage and physical damage. As for the empowered gem abilities, you definitely want to have the class gem because they actually ended up buffing your shadow clone like, I don't know, a year ago or something like that, and it's surprisingly really, really powerful now. Basically, by attacking enemies, you have a chance of spawning a shadow clone, which unfortunately is really, really dumb and won't track enemies very well. But when it starts attacking hard. Other options could be Stinging Curse, I don't know, Cubit Curtain if you need survivability, but Pyro Disc I would say is the only one you should really try to get. And as for your cosmic gems, you have 2 different abilities. You have Vampirium, which you're not really gonna need the lifesteal, but Vampirium does give you a movement speed boost. So if you absolutely wanna prioritize speed with your Lancer, you could use Vampirium. But if you're getting to the end game and the enemies are way too tanky, you're going to need to use Berserk Battler instead, just because of the light stat it gives you. So we'll start off by saying that the Chloromancer used to be God tier and in fact was one of the strongest boss killers in the game. That has since changed, as it did end up getting nerfed quite a bit, but that doesn't mean that you should completely underestimate the class. I know that's kind of a theme of these videos, but frankly speaking, people underestimate classes in this game far too often. I will say up front, you're probably not going to be using the Chloromancer as a speed farmer. I mean, you can if you absolutely want to main it, but frankly speaking, this is a boss killing class, and that's it. So subclass ability is just going to be the standard same old subclass abilities you would use on any of the classes, with Solarion being pretty much the best one just because of that extra light value, and the burning damage over time effect is, I mean, it's okay. It's not great. But I always end up using Knight subclass ability just because the extra flask capacity usually equals to a lot of damage overall, just in terms of being able to chug all of your flasks. Bard apparently is okay for speed farming, same with Lunar Lancer, although I don't know if I would recommend those necessarily for the Chloromancer. You can kind of just experiment though, even in these videos I kind of talk about like, oh, these are the best subclass abilities. A lot of these have been slowly tweaked over the years, and some of them are a lot better than I remember, and then a lot of people remember, but people just don't really experiment that much, myself included, because once you find something that works, you just stay with it. As for your gear stat priority, you're going to focus on attack speed, because obviously that's where a bulk of your damage comes from, and energy regen will allow you to throw down more plants, but you can only throw down a limited amount of plants in general. So in most cases, I would still suggest you go for crit damage, but you can experiment. It's up to you. It's just the crit damage will more than likely give you more overall damage. And then if you really want to use this class for speed farming, you're going to stay with the attack speed, but swap the crit damage off for movement speed instead, because that'll allow you to travel from dungeon to dungeon faster, and you won't need that extra crit damage as much as you need the attack speed. Now for the Chloromancer subclass abilities, there are a couple options. There's going to be Cyto Barrier, which creates a shield at low health that reduces damage. I can attest to this being a pretty useless ability. The shield is not that great, especially in consideration, compared to Cubic Curtain or whatever. Weird Growth, after dealing damage, gain a buff that spawns plants randomly nearby for a short time. This one is all right. The problem is that you still have the limited amount of plants, and this does not increase that cap, I don't think. It might be a separate thing, but most of all, you're just going to be focusing on Gatling. So that's going to make it so that basic attacks have a chance to spawn a mini green Gatling, and mini green Gatlings have a chance to spawn mini green Gatlings. And that's just going to end up giving you a huge burst of damage when those trigger. Unfortunately, it is random, and it's a pretty low rate. Also, the Gatlings are incredibly stupid, because once they pick a target, if that target even slightly moves out of the way, they're going to shoot in a straight line, which I find really annoying because the enemies in this game actually have pretty decent tracking for where you're going to be. So I don't know why that doesn't work for the enemies as well. Your best banner in slot is of course going to end up being the torches from Leviathans, whether it be the low tier or the high tier, but also the Saber Skull, which I currently have on my Draco. That's why I swapped. I like this one because it's the magic damage one, but it also gives you the movement speed. And as I will attest in all of my videos, movement speed is incredibly important to me. I don't like going slow in this game. Point being, maybe you prefer one of the Aura Perma torches more so than the movement speed, but that's entirely up to you. For your ally, you have a couple different options. There's going to be Starry Skyfire, which is going to be probably the big one that you'll use because of the magic damage, the light, and the cooldown recovery speed. For this ally, you come from the hub, go over to the Grand Orrery, and you're going to end up having this node anyways because of the light value, but it's also going to be what gives you Starry Skyfire. Orchin, if you want to be a speedy class, because this will give you light movement speed and magic damage, which from the hub area is going to be located down here in my uncle's basement, which is going to end up being Orchin right here. It's a Paragon ally, which means you need to have Trovian loops from Paragon levels, and you gotta have a Paragon mark as well. But yeah, it's pretty expensive to get this amongst all of the other items, but you'll do it slowly over time. There's also going to end up being the Mini Water Mana Beast, which as far as I've heard is the highest damage allies in the game, just because that extra magic damage and crit damage combined with the light equals more damage than the other allies that have more light but less crit damage. So from the hub, you're going to go over into the Crafter's Corner, and you're going to go down into the basement. And unfortunately, you'll have to get pretty much maxed out with the Mystic Arts. I don't even have these allies yet because I'm not really going out of my way to farm for the very, very specific elemental dust that I need, or should I say the elemental mana. So going into the skill tree, there's going to be a couple abilities you're going to prioritize. In my opinion, you would go for the Life Leech node first and foremost, because that's going to end up obviously giving you Life Leech, which makes most classes in the game almost invincible. And then again, I prioritize the movement speed nodes. The light nodes are very, very important, and the damage nodes. You would just end up following the magic damage tree instead of me, which has the physical damage tree because I main Shadow Hunter. Now then, for your flask and vial pretty much all of these that I have favorited are going to be your best option. Death Defying is the one that I usually go for just because I'm lazy and I don't want to have to even bother pressing the Q key. This way it also saves you the animation time of your character drinking the flask. But in most cases, you want to use the buff from the flask. So you can use the Elysian Bandolier if you absolutely just need to keep chugging. Vampiric is okay. Vial of Unleashed Power I don't think really works on Chloro as much as it used to, but I could be wrong. Valorous is all right. Conjurer's Crucible is a good one just because if you have high enough magic find, you can literally regain your flasks faster than you spend them per dungeon, because magic find will trigger and you'll end up restocking your flasks. As for the emblems, unfortunately with Trove's new end game, you know, the long shade area, it's kind of forced all of us to always use the arcane emblem. Once upon a time, there was a point where you didn't have to use arcane emblem and you could experiment, but now since we just need raw damage, you're kind of locked into always using this one. And then for your side emblem, that's kind of up to you. You could use Trailblazing if you're speed farming, Zealous if you need the energy, Unyielding if you need the survivability. Chromatic emblem will be the best in most cases because that'll allow you to utilize your abilities more often because of the reduced cooldown. The mid-game stats that you want to work towards and then move up from with the Chloromancer is going to be anywhere from 60 to 80k magic damage and then 50 to 60% crit hit with, let's say, 800% crit damage, and you kind of just move up from there, trying to keep those stats even keel. It's not as important as you would think, but most of all, I'm saying this as a gauge in case you're noticing like one of your stats is significantly lower than the others. Now, before we get into the gems and all of that stuff, I do have to reiterate in all of these videos, is your class level 30? Because that should be your top priority first. You shouldn't even bother focusing on the end game until you've got your class level 30, because getting your class level 30 is going to unlock all of the gem slots, and the gem slots significantly give you a huge boost in power, like beyond gear and anything else. Gems are the cat's pajamas. I don't know if that's a positive thing. And then there's going to end up being the coefficiency of my builds, which are not coefficient. In fact, I've been kind of dabbling behind the scenes, testing out coefficiency builds and so on and so forth. And frankly speaking, I'm not noticing much of a difference between a maxed out coefficiency class and then what I have for a lot of my builds. So take that as you will, but I'm just saying that you don't have to follow the stats that I'm going to present to you to the letter. You can kind of mix and match it up a little bit, and that's okay because it's not going to make as significant a difference as you would think. So I'm going to be focusing on my gems on my Draco just because I'm too lazy to swap them all to the Chloromancer, but you'll still just build them all the same. For all of your empowered colored gems, with the cosmic gems being their own separate category, you're going to focus on getting 2 pearls or boosts into magic damage, 1 boost or pearl into crit damage, and then no boost into crit hit. You're pretty much going to focus on that for all of your empowered gems, excluding the cosmic gem. And then for the lesser gems, the way that I like to make this digestible for you guys is I say 3 of them this way, 3 of them this way, because you have a total of 6 lesser elemental gems. The cosmic gems, again, are completely segmented off. So 3 of your lesser gems are going to follow the same stats as the empowered gems. So 2 boost magic, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3 are going to be 2 boosts into crit damage, 1 boost magic damage, no boost crit hit. And when you end up getting your crit hit to 100%, you can pretty much cycle any extra crit hit off into max health to give you a little bit more survivability. Although again, it's not super important and you're gonna be squishy in this game anyway. As for the cosmic gems, all of them are going to be the exact same, wherein you need every boost into light and then no boost into crit damage and magic damage. So for your empowered gem abilities, you could go for the class gem. It's not mandatory just because when empowered growth is active, your ultimate Chloromancer heals nearby allies and plants. It's really, really bad, the scaling of that. So it's not mandatory. I would still suggest you go for the class gem just because it's a really easy to get powerful empowered gem, right? Granted, it is time gated just because of the keys that you're going to have to spend on it if you're absolutely at the beginning of the game. But anyways, I'm just saying that you don't have to use it. I don't know, pick your poison, it's up to you. Now, for the other Empower Gems, I would recommend Pyrodisc for movement speed, Cubic Curtain for survivability, and what's that other one? The Flower one? Apparently that one's not bad. It's kind of a secret powerhouse gem that does give you a little bit of extra damage. Is it a flower or is it snare? I don't know. And then more important than all of that is gonna be the Cosmic Gem. Now you have two options here. Vampirium is going to give you lifesteal, which you don't need because of the skill tree, but it will also give you a movement speed boost. So if you really want to do speed farming, you would use Vampirium. However, if you're at the end game, the only thing that really matters is raw damage, in which case Berserker Battler is going to be the required gem. The Dino Tamer. Yet another class that you don't really hear people talk about too much, but the people that do main it know how god tier it is. Most of all, it's got to do with the movement speed of this character, because your most optimal style of play is actually going to be having your ultimate ability up 24/7. And the Dino Tamer actually always had the damage and survivability because it's a class that doesn't use stamina, which means technically you can fight like this, just staying in the air and shooting down at enemies. So unless you're dealing with something ranged, well, you'll be able to slowly but surely kill it. I will say that the Dino Babies kind of suck. There's not really much reason to use them. The main thing that you're gonna be doing is using your ult and using your net in your ult, because this is going to do heaps of damage. It's also going to snare enemies, which can be helpful in delves with your team. So subclass ability is gonna just kind of be the same old options as any class. You could use the Bard because randomly you can get the Bard's song that gives you movement speed. It also has some crit damage, which is nice. Fae is an okay one, but you're not going to be using that flying speed, so the bomb itself doesn't really matter too much. The Lunar Lancer subclass ability is going to be okay. Unfortunately, that physical damage is going to waste, but Lunacy mode is not. Knight subclass, that's probably not one you want to end up using, because you're only going to be using the Knight subclass ability to get that extra flask capacity, because your ultimate ability does not actually count as mount movement speed. It scales off of player movement speed, which means that you are not seeing the secondary benefit of the Knight subclass ability. But for my money, as always, it's just gonna be Solarion, because that's gonna be extra light, and light is very important. As far as your gear stat priority, for normal dungeon farming and what have you, you would go for a combination of movement speed and attack speed. Thankfully, you don't need energy regen on this class. If you absolutely want to use this character in deep delves, fighting leviathans and stuff, the only thing that you would do is instead swap your movement speed into crit damage while still keeping the attack speed, because that's going to give you more optimal, well, damage. But for my money, I would always stick with the movement speed, because that's where this class shines more so as a speed farmer than versus a boss killer. The Dino Tamer's various ring abilities are going to be Oh My Dinos, which Dino Buddy now spawns 2 minions instead of 1. However, this ability is still kind of useless because you're gonna be soft capped at 6 minions, if I recall. That's just how all of the minion classes work. Mr. Chomp Chomp, which is going to make your Dino Mount also spawn a T-Rex minion. And then there's going to be Deep Wounds, which applies a damage increase debuff to enemies dealt damage by Dino Tamer and their Dino summons. That Deep Wounds is not worth it for the buff. As far as Dino Tamer mains are concerned, you pretty much always want to focus on Mr. Chomp Chomp, just because that name is as hilarious as it is also quite powerful, surprisingly. So your best banner in slot is going to end up being the torches from Leviathans. Namely, there's going to end up being the Permatorch as the absolute best. Now, something that I haven't been doing in these videos, which in hindsight I probably should have done, is if you go to the Sunseeker's Crystal Forge, this is where you will end up crafting up your torches into the stronger variation, which this is a really good one for physical damage. This one's a really good one for magic. And in my opinion, this would be the best one to go for if you're a magic class, in particular Dino Tamer, because this is going to end up giving you damage, but also movement speed. And I don't even get me started on where you get most of these items because they're just mostly from the delves. The best allies in slot for Dino Tamer are going to be Orchian out of the Paragon tree because you'll get light, magic damage, and more importantly, a movement speed boost when a nearby enemy dies. So from the hub, you would go down here, and this is where you're going to be able to craft Orchian for these various resources. Namely, the most difficult one is going to be the Paragon marks, which you need to get from Prime Paragon pinatas. Starry Skyfire out of the star chart, which is going to increase your cooldown recovery speed. And that again is very important. Nay, I would say even more important than the movement speed buff you get from Orchian, just because this way you'll be able to have your ultimate ability up more often. And that's kind of the most important thing to his kit. So from the hub, going all the way up here to the star chart, you're naturally going to end up having Starry Skyfire because it's in one of the light nodes anyways. And as we'll end up talking about when we talk about the skill tree, this is kind of a mandatory node. Lastly, if you just want raw damage and nothing but, you would go for the mini water mana beast because that extra magic damage and crit damage on this ally actually equates to more overall damage versus the extra light you get on the other allies. From the hub, going down into the basement over here is where you'll be able to find the Mystic Arts, and all the way down in the collectibles, this is going to be the mini water mana beast, which you can see I still haven't crafted yet. But yeah, that's just because it requires a lot of mana from a specific elemental world. So for the skill tree, these are the abilities that I would prioritize. There's the Life Leech node, which will pretty much make almost all of your classes invincible. Not entirely, but the Life Leech is very, very good in this game. The movement speed nodes are always important to me, and then you would go for the light nodes and the damage nodes. Of course, just rather than what I have for my skill tree, which is the physical damage build, you would end up going for the magic damage build. So just follow this chart that I have on screen. These are pretty much the best flasks in the game. I always just use Death Defying because I'm lazy, but frankly speaking, as the Dino Tamer, you can use the Elysian Bandolier if you need an ultimate burst of boss damage, but otherwise Conjurer's Crucible for when you're doing long farming stints, because this will end up triggering every time Magic Find triggers, and if your Magic Find is high enough, you can recover more flasks than you expend while you're hunting, which is why a lot of people usually like using it for farming. But for me, I always like using Death Defying just because the end game enemies will usually end up one-tapping you, and that's just not fun having to deal with that. As for your emblems, because we've got the long shade difficulty and so on, unfortunately, you're probably never going to be able to swap Arcane Emblem off. Of course, it does depend which area of the game you focus on, because if you're like me, you probably don't like the endgame area very much and can go a couple difficulties down, which means you could swap to whatever you want. But for most of you, you're going to be using Arcane Emblem. For your secondary emblem, you could use Trailblazing, although it's not really recommended, over Chromatic. That's going to be the big one because once again, you are going to try and stay in your ultimate ability as much as possible, which means movement speed from various other effects aren't going to matter as much as having your ultimate up. But earlier on in the game, when you don't have max crit hit, you would use Sure Strike Emblem. So the mid-game stat goal you should be focusing on with Dino Tamer would be somewhere around like 60 to 80,000 magic damage, getting your crit hit to roughly 60%. Anything higher than that is obviously good. And then having your crit damage percent at 800%. Again, that's just for like mid-tier. You would build up upon that, of course, trying to get 100% crit hit as soon as possible. Now, before we end up getting into all of the gems and so on and so forth, I gotta mention this in all of these videos, but your top priority before touching any of the end game stuff should be getting your class max level, because that'll end up unlocking all of the different gem slots, which then in turn gives you the biggest power boost. Also, these videos are not aimed at being the most coefficient, because each of the classes is very different in their own like stats that they end up having when you have them maxed out. And so coefficiency builds slightly vary for every single individual class. I will make a coefficiency guide at some point in the future. I'm planning to, but I want to get these videos done first. So I'm going to swap over to my Draco just because that's where I have my good magic gems. So we're going to bulk the cosmic gems in their own category that we'll talk about later. For your empowered gems, you want to have all three of them be 2 boosts or pearls into magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. That's really important to just have those boosts in everything but crit hit. And then for your lesser gems, not cosmic gems, but just your lesser colored gems, we're gonna have 3 of them the exact same. So 2 boost magic, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3, you're going to end up having 2 boost crit damage instead, and then 1 boost magic damage, no boost crit hit. Eventually, when you end up having 100% crit hit, you can start swapping crit hit off of your gems to get more max health, so you have a little bit more survivability, but it's not super important. And again, if you have like some variety of gems, like this one I have is 3 boost crit damage, that's totally fine. Now your cosmic gems are way easier because the small gems and the big boy gem are all going to have 3 boosts into light, no boosts into crit damage and magic damage. Now for the empowered gem abilities, you definitely want to have the class gem ability, which increases the duration of the ultimate ability, which again is going to be what makes your ult like so good. It also ends up making the summon dino mount increases attack speed of the ultimate ability, the acid spit projectile as well. It's just, yeah, you need to have this class gem because it's a speedy boy. I would also focus on trying to get pyro disc as a must because that's going to give you a lot more movement speed. And then you can kind of just pick the last gem to be whatever you want. You could go for Cubic Curtain just because it'll give you more survivability. Or in my opinion, I would say Explosive Epilogue is probably gonna be the best one just because that'll give you really good damage for crowds, and Dino Tamer kind of exceeds at handling crowds rather than single target. As for the Cosmic Gem, you do technically have 2 options. Vampirium will give you Life Leech, which you don't need, but it will give you movement speed, so it's up to you. But ideally you would get Berserk Battler because that's going to just slowly increase your light value as you're fighting enemies, and thus it gives you more damage overall. The Vanguard was Trove's first fist fighting character, which was pretty exciting back in the day. Now it's kind of at a place where it's good for speed farming and not much else. One thing to keep in mind is that the ranged mode is not widely talked about, and that's because this class's ranged mode was never really fully balanced. People complained about how much the ranged mode was underperforming, and they did end up buffing it, it just wasn't enough. Another fun little tidbit of Trove trivia is back in the day, the devs had an insane amount of knock up with its uppercut attack that would actually push enemies like so far out of the map that people just complained, and they just kept reducing it until finally they listened and got rid of it altogether. Now, if only they would remove knockback from enemies, we'd be set. But yeah, the class itself is more so used as a speed dungeon farmer, not really used for delves, and most definitely not used for bosses. So as for the subclass ability, I mean, you got a couple options, but generally speaking, you guys should know at this point. Lunacy is going to be really good just because it'll make you get more movement speed and do more damage, and that's kind of the main point of the Vanguard. So the only other thing that I could see you using is maybe Candy Barb, just for that very unlikely chance of gaining a movement speed buff, and maybe the Bard one because of the low chance of gaining the movement speed buff. But for my money, I would say Lunacy, maybe using the Mounted Cavalry, like the Knight subclass ability, just so that you can get that mount movement speed to kind of keep up, but that's up to you. You wouldn't really be using some of the good subclass abilities like the Solarion because you're not really a damage dealer, but yeah, Solarion would end up being good just because of the extra light as well, if you absolutely must use it as a fighter. Now, your gear stat priority is going to end up being the same as always, which is attack speed and movement speed, because that's where this class shines. Now, if you absolutely want to main this character for every aspect of the game, let's say you're trying to do delves, you're trying to do, I don't know why you would on the Vanguard, but Leviathans, you would instead swap out that movement speed because that's not helping your overall damage for crit damage instead. So you would keep the attack speed because that helps your DPS, and then the crit damage would also help towards that. But generally the rule of thumb is attack speed, movement speed. So moving on to the crystal rings, there's Champions Congregate, which makes it so that the buff from Fired Up and Force Flash will now apply to 2 additional allies that are nearby, which means that it doesn't help you with farming because this game is very strongly independent, playing solo, maybe with a group, but most of all just in the delves, so maybe that could be helpful there. Otherwise, there's going to be combo, so Energy Blast now applies the same damage increase that Eye Lasers applies. That one's okay, but Hero's Stand will make Laser Leap and Hero's Charge grant a buff that heals while dealing damage for a short time. Frankly speaking, none of these are good. I guess if I had to choose one, I would say combo, just because the Energy Blast boost, but the Energy Blast is again going to end up being a ranged ability. So it's kind of lame that you have to end up using a Crystal Ring effect in order to end up getting the range to be like kind of optimal. But the main reason you never use ranged is because your number one ability in melee mode gives you a movement speed buff. So yeah, frankly speaking, you don't need a Crystal Ring ability. The banner that you would use in slot, if you'll excuse me for swapping to my Shadow Hunter, would obviously be any of the Leviathan banners, Permatorches being, you know, the best. And I always use the Knotted Shadow Permatorch just because it gives you that extra movement speed, which is something that I really prioritize on my classes. And again, Vanguard is all about speed. So for your ally, because once again, you're not really using this character as a damage character, we're actually going to ignore all other allies and just say, use the speedy ones. So Scorpius is going to end up giving you a movement speed ability when a nearby enemy dies. And then otherwise it would just be like Raptor Berserker if you're earlier on in the game, something like that. Basically anything that gives you that movement speed buffed. Otherwise you don't need any of the other allies. So coming over here from the hub area, it would just end up being in the Astrolabe or the star chart. And I think it's, is it this one? No, that's Starry Skyfire, so it's gotta be this one. Yeah, this is Scorpius right here. You'll inevitably get Scorpius because you need that light node anyway. Speaking of the skill tree, you're going to end up prioritizing the Life Leech node, which will give you a lot more survivability, which is pretty good on the Vanguard, frankly speaking. And then otherwise, I prioritize the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and the damage nodes. Of course, following the same tree as me, just because I have my skill tree set towards physical damage. As for your flask, frankly speaking, any of these are the best flasks in the game. I always use Death Defying because I'm lazy. I'm very upfront about that with you guys, especially because the end game enemies are going to hit you so hard that you kind of need to have Death Defying just to survive long enough. I mean, if I think about trying to take a Vanguard into the, D15, U12 Longshade world, it brings me immediate pain because I don't think that this class is viable for there. But anyways, yeah, that would be my pick. Otherwise, Conjurer's Crucible, just because it'll give you longevity of farming, so long as you have a high enough magic find. As for the emblem, that's a little bit more open-ended. You could use Martial Emblem. I mean, you pretty much have to use Martial Emblem because the endgame enemies are so tanky. But if you're sticking to a lower Uber world, just because you're, trying to be as optimal as far as your speed farm is concerned, maybe you're just trying to end up grinding gearboxes, so you stick in U6 or E9, I think it is. I'm still trying to memorize the difficulty titles. But anyways, yeah, Martial Emblem would be a must. Trailblazing would probably be your next bet. If you absolutely want damage on this character, Zealous can be useful just because then you can spam your right click laser, consume a flash, spam your laser, because that's kind of where all of the damage comes from with this class. And then otherwise, Unyielding would give you survivability, and yeah, that's pretty much it. You could use Sure Strike if you're earlier on in the game and you don't have high enough stats though. Speaking of stats, let's talk about the mid-game stats, in which case you would try to focus your physical damage to 50 to 60k, something around there for the baseline. Your crit damage would end up being 800%, let's say, and then your crit hit value 50 to 60%, trying to get that to 100% as soon as possible, since the way that crit damage works in this game is if you have 100% crit hit, it means that you're going to crit 100% of the time. Again, these are just kind of a mild suggestion for the midpoint. If you notice one of your stats is overputting against the other, it's not that important whether they fluctuate a little bit, and more importantly, you would just build up from there. Speaking of building up, before we end up getting into the gems and all of those stats and junk like that, I gotta say this in all of these videos, get your class level 30 before you even try to think about handling the end game areas on pretty much any class, frankly speaking, because you're going to end up getting so much more power from being able to equip every slot of your gems that you gotta get a class to level 30 first. Because sometimes I'll get people come around and be like, how can I increase my PR? And it's like, well, what level are you? Oh, I'm level 25. And it's like, then why are you worried about your PR? Also, these videos are not aimed at being 100% coefficient builds. When we talk about the gems, more specifically the boost that you're going to have with the stats, I'm kind of giving you like a ballpark estimate of what you can aim for, because When it comes to coefficiency, every single class in this game starts with different stats and thus they end with different stats, which means there's a very subtle nuance to each and every character in the game to being their max coefficiency. I'll work on one of those videos at some point, but generally speaking, it's a lot of nerd talk that doesn't really matter because of how easy Trove is. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important, especially for the stupid long shade difficulty, but if you'll pardon me, I'm gonna swap over to my Shadow Hunter, and then we're gonna talk about my gems. So to try and make this as digestible as possible for you guys, we're gonna talk about the lesser colored gems and then the empowered colored gems and leave the cosmic gems completely on the side until later. When you look at your gems, these little dots right here that just look like a pearl of wisdom, we call them pearls or boosts. And that is basically going to end up optimizing the stat value that they're on. So what I would suggest, just as again, this is just a mere suggestion. If you have slight variance, it doesn't matter, but you would have 3 of your lesser gems be 2 pearls physical damage, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearl crit hit. And then the other 3 would be the reversal, where you would take those 2 pearls onto crit damage, 1 pearl physical, no pearls crit hit. And then I like to make all of my empowered colored gems just 2 pearls physical damage, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearls crit hit. Of course, once you get to 100% crit hit, you can end up cycling that off of your gems for max health, just so you get a little more survivability. Your cosmic gems, however, are a lot easier to build, but they can take a lot longer to build depending on the items that you have. You're gonna have all your boosts into light, all 3 of them. And then the extra stats are gonna be crit damage, physical damage. This applies to the empowered gem as well. Now, speaking of the empowered gem abilities, you do want to have the class ability, which is Hero's Mantle. So it makes it so that connecting with the final blow of a combo reduces the ability cooldown slightly. That's very, very important because as you're like punching enemies, basically the uppercut is going to reduce cooldown on your other abilities so that you can spam your movement abilities and such. I will say that the ideal method of playing this class, or should I say the intended design of it, is that you would swap into range mode, do a bunch of your buffs, swap back to melee mode, and do a bunch of your buffs. And that's kind of the cycle that they're trying to portray with this character. It's just that the range mode is so garbage, no one does it. As for your other empowered gems, I would suggest Pyrodisc is a must because you're trying to go as fast as possible. And then, I don't know, up to that point, it's kind of up to you because Explosive Epilogue, as far as I know, only works with ranged, so that's not really that helpful. I guess you could use Cubic Curtain just to have a little more survivability. Being a melee character means you gotta get up close and personal. And as for the Cosmic Gem ability, while Berserk Battler is the highly suggested gem on most characters because of the high amount of damage output that it gives you, for the Vanguard, I would say to use Vampirium. Not because you need that life steal, because if you have life steal out of the skill tree, that gem's ability kind of becomes moot. Most of all, it's because the movement speed that you get from Vampirium can make a big difference for speed farming. So the Bard is one of those weirder classes in Trove that a lot of people like, but certain people it just doesn't really vibe with. I'm one of the latter. I just don't really know why, but I don't find this class to be particularly fun, probably because the majority of its gameplay is you balancing all of the various attacks so that you can keep your Bard's song up. It's a very technical class, which is why some people really, really enjoy it, and those that don't like it at all. So checking out the subclass abilities, there's a couple different options, namely the same ones that we've always seen, which is gonna be the Lunacy, because it'll end up triggering, which makes you go big, and then it gives you more movement speed and more damage. And the Bard is kind of primarily used as a speed farmer, but you can actually use it pretty effectively on bosses too. You wouldn't really think so. Knight subclass ability is good for that extra flask capacity, especially if you want big bursts of damage. Your mount movement speed is going to be kind of irrelevant because so long as you have your Bard song going at all times, you're gonna be a speedy boy. And then of course, the super easy subclass that everyone uses for almost anything is gonna be the Phoenix Fire Solarion subclass just because of that extra light value. But in this case, it's kind of a pick your poison type of thing. A couple things you might want to experiment with is the Pirate Captain subclass ability and even the Fae Trickster subclass ability are surprisingly strong. As for your gear stat priority, you're going to be focusing on attack speed because that's going to be how you optimize more damage, essentially, your damage per second DPS, and movement speed because that's primarily where this class is going to shine, is with speed farming as quick as possible. Now, If you absolutely want to use it as a boss killer or use it at the end game, you're instead going to swap that movement speed out for crit damage on your gear, because having higher crit damage means you have more overall damage, and movement speed isn't really helping towards that damage goal. It's just helping you get from point A to point B faster. Now, as for the Bard's Crystal Ring effect, you've got the 3 different options. Peaceful Moment, so Peaceful Song buff reduces damage done to allies. Who cares about that? Everyone's tanky in this game anyways. Or the enemies damage you so much that that buff is worthless. Musical Master, the Bard gains a critical damage buff when all 3 Bard songs are active, which is probably going to end up being the biggest one that you want to go for. It depends how much the crit damage buff is. And then there's Overload, so at max melody, gain a small damage boost. As far as I know, Overload is the best one for your Crystal Ring ability, but it does also require the most effort in terms of gameplay. As for your best banner in slot, I mean, frankly speaking, it's just going to end up being the usual banners that you would expect, the Permatorch, the Leviathan torches just in general, but you're actually going to be focusing on the magic damage Permatorches, because here's the crazy thing is, even though the Vanguardian uses a fist weapon and it's physical damage, when you're playing as the Bard and you equip a fist weapon, it's going to automatically swap to magic damage. So I would recommend the Saber Skull, Sabris Skull? I don't know. 500 magic damage, a little bit of movement speed. That's the big thing for me. Again, I always prioritize movement speed. You do have a couple different options for your ally. Namely, you can end up using the mini water mana beast because of the sheer amount of damage that it'll give you. So coming from the hub, you'll go down into here, and you gotta get pretty high into the Mystic Arts in order to craft this, but this is going to end up being the magic crit damage ally. Starry Skyfire, which is out of the star chart, because this is going to end up giving you magic damage, light, cooldown recovery speed, which honestly isn't super important on the Bard. From here in the hub, you go all the way up to the top of the Astrolabe and the Grand Orrery, and then way over here is going to be Starry Skyfire, which you're going to inevitably get anyways because you have to get the light node out of the skill tree. There is also Orchian out of the Paragon, and this is going to end up being your movement speed buff when a nearby enemy dies. So coming from the hub over into the Paragon basement here, this is where you would end up crafting Orchian. As far as how you would end up building the skill tree, it's pretty much going to be unanimously the same across all classes, but keep in mind I do prioritize movement speed. So first and foremost, you would get the Life Leech node, which is going to make pretty much all of your classes like way tankier, if not invincible. Then you would end up getting the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and the damage nodes. Of course, the main difference between my skill tree and your skill tree would be that you would actually prioritize the magic damage. My skill tree is set up for physical damage. As for your flasks, these are pretty much just the best options for you, honestly speaking. You can use Elysian Bandolier if you need to have more flask capacity for bursts and bursts of damage, which is usually good for boss killing and Leviathans and such. But otherwise, I always use Death Defying because I'm lazy and because endgame enemies hit so ridiculously hard that you kind of need that survivability, because the enemies will usually just one-shot you because this game's an unbalanced mess. There are a couple different options though. I guess Vial of Unleashed Power could probably work, except for the internal cooldown. I remember that this vial used to actually be really, really good back in the day, but I think it got a nerf or something like a couple years back. I haven't used it since, but maybe it's still viable. I don't know. And then otherwise, Conjurer's Crucible is a good one for long-term farming. So long as you have the magic find, you'll just keep getting your flask back. Oh my God, pardon me. I have such a massive headache right now. Okay, so for emblems, yeah, Arcane Emblem would be a must just because of how much damage you need to do to a lot of these enemies and so on and so forth. You can use Trailblazing for a speed farming emblem. Again, can end up being quite important. And then otherwise, Unyielding Emblem if you need survivability to tank hits from enemies and such. And then there's also Sure Strike if you're earlier on in the game and you don't have enough crit damage, or sorry, crit hit. As for the mid-game stat goal that you would aim for, probably around 80,000 magic damage at the base value, not like the additive or whatever. And then your crit hit you want to have at 50 to 60% at the very least. Higher than that is still better. And then your crit damage at around 800%. Again, this is just a mid-tier goal. Just if you notice that one of your stats is kind of lacking in that regard, that's where you would just end up bringing it up. But when you get further into the end game, it's kind of a little bit more nuanced than that. But generally speaking, you just bring the stats up from there and focus on getting your hands on 100% crit hit as soon as possible, because it's going to make the biggest difference. And before we get into the gems, I'm just going to say this because I gotta say it in every one of these videos. Before you even focus on your PR or making your character stronger, get your character to max level. So many people are always like, how can I make myself stronger? And then they're like level 25 or something. Getting max level will unlock all of the gem slots, allowing you to equip gems to every single one of your gem slots, thus giving you the highest boost of power and damage and PR that you can possibly end up getting outside of various other mechanics in the game. But my point being is you gotta get your class maxed out first. This also isn't a guide for nerds focusing on coefficiency or anything. I'll have one of those guides sometime in the future, but needless to say that each of the different classes has slightly varying stats in their starting position and when they're max level and such. And so the stats that you would pick for that specific character are usually that specific character's most coefficient stats, and it wouldn't apply to any of the others, which means we would have to do this whole song and dance rigmarole all over again, where I make guides on every single character. Suffice to say, coefficiency doesn't matter as much as people pretend that it does, unless you're doing like super deep delves or being with like one of the best groups in the game or something. And if you'll pardon me, I'm gonna swap over to my Draco because that's where I have all of my gems. First, let's start out with the colored, not cosmic gems, the colored lesser gems. So 3 of the 6 lesser gems, I would say to get 2 boosts to magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3 gems are going to end up being 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost magic damage, no boost crit hit. Any variety between that isn't going to make that much of a difference, so go ham, mix it up. You can see I've got this one gem that's got 3 boosts in crit damage. It's not a big deal. The main thing that I would say is once you end up having 100% crit hit, then you can start cycling that stat off of your gems in favor of max health. Now, as for your empowered colored gems, those would end up being the same as the first 3 lesser gems. So 2 boost magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. Whereas the cosmic gems will all unanimously have all 3 boosts into light and then no boosts into crit damage and magic damage. This includes both the lesser gems and the empowered gem. As for the empowered gem abilities, the class gem ability is a must. So the bard has increased attack range and bard's songs increase effectiveness. Wish that we ended up having more like actual game statistics that the game would tell us about these things, but I mean, either way, it's just a must. Then for the other empowered gems, I would suggest Pyrodisc, just because speed farming is a big deal. And then otherwise you can kind of just choose whatever you want for the last gem. It's not as important as you would think because none of the era gems really affect you that much. I've heard that the flower one can secretly be really good, but I don't know if that's like a specific thing to the bard or whatever. Cubic Curtain will give you a lot more survivability though. And the cosmic gem, that kind of depends on how you want to use the bard. I would say that if you're speed farming and not focusing on going to long shade or end game difficulties, Vampirium can be useful. The Vampirium gem will give you lifesteal, which you won't need because the lifesteal you get out of the skill tree, but it will also give you movement speed, which can be invaluable if you're just speed farming. However, if you're going to the end game, if you're, in it for the long haul, so to speak, with the bard, then you would use Berserk Battler, because that's just going to end up increasing your light as you damage enemies and thus give you more damage that you kind of need for the end game. And at long last, we finally get to the Solarion, and this class is one of the strongest single target characters in the game. Like people say Boomeranger hits harder, but no. Solarion single target is king. Boomeranger is actually a lot better in most cases for long shade and end game, just because it can handle like large groups of enemies, and Solarion does not really strive for that. It does depend though, because if you end up having the crystal ring effect and so on and so forth, the whole thing about this character's kit is damage over time. So you're trying to get all of your special abilities to proc on an enemy at the same time. and it just melts your opponents. Now, for a subclass ability, unfortunately, you aren't going to be able to use the Solarion subclass ability because, of course, it is the Solarion class. So you do have a couple different options. Lunacy does give you the physical damage, which you don't really want, but it also does give you the sort of crazy where your character goes big and does a lot of damage. I've heard tell from a lot of other people that the Bard is a pretty good one just because of that movement speed, because unfortunately this class kind of sucks when it comes to like speed farming. It's more so a boss killer, so you would just pick your poison and try to pick something that you feel is more optimal for you. Knight subclass can be really good just because of the extra flask capacity. The Pirate Captain one is okay. You wouldn't think so just because of how random the naval gunfire like the cannonball is, but it does do a decent amount of damage when or if it connects. As for the stat priority, you would of course go for attack speed no matter what, because that's going to end up giving you more damage overall, because this character, is affected by attack speed and so on. But otherwise you would end up having movement speed. If you absolutely want to use this character for speed farming and such, you're gonna need as much movement speed as you can because this character's movement speed kind of sucks. However, for delves, bosses, and whatever, which is most of all where this class shines, you would end up having crit damage and attack speed instead, just because then it's pretty much as much damage as you can get on your gear. Now for the Crystal Ring effect, you have the 3 different options, which is Guiding Flight, so Prismatic Blast, and Guiding Light. Now also apply the Solar Wings slow fall effect. Basically just gives you slow fall, that one's useless. Solar Stance, this will remove the Solar Wings effect, now applying a damage reduction buff for a short time. As you know with Trove, damage reduction is irrelevant. And then Prismatic Chain, this is the Crystal Ring effect that you will want to go for, where it makes Prismatic Blast, causes enemies damaged by it to also fire off a Prismatic Blast of their own, damaging nearby enemies. If you have this ability, then Solarion is extremely competent in fighting large groups of enemies, which is its initial weakness if you don't end up using that. The best banner in slot is of course going to end up being the Leviathan torches, with the perma torches being the best options. I always use Knotted Shadow just as the crafted perma torch because of course Solarion being a bow character is physical damage, and then on top of that this gives movement speed, which is something that I prioritize on all of my classes. And as I mentioned before, Solarion is innately really slow. As for the best ally in slot, in most cases, that'll end up being Scorpius for speed farming because of that movement speed boost when a nearby enemy dies. So coming over from the hub all the way up here in the skill tree, Scorpius is going to end up being all the way up here, which you'll inevitably end up getting anyways because of the light value that you need out of the skill tree anyway. Or the mini fire mana beast is, as far as I've heard, the best physical ally in terms of raw damage, because that extra crit damage percentage equals more damage than the extra light that you would end up getting out of Scorpius. Coming from the hub, you would end up going down into the basement instead of up top with the Astrolabe, and you do have to max out the Mystic Arts profession in order to craft this, and then you have to get the mana embers from Lava Worlds. So yeah, kind of sucks. You're going to be flashbanged. As for the stats that you would prioritize in the skill tree, you would go for the Life Leech node first and foremost because it'll make your characters across the board so much more tanky and have so much more survivability. And then otherwise, I prioritize the movement speed nodes, the light nodes, and of course the damage nodes. As for your best flask and slot, honestly, it's any of these. Just pick whichever you want. Elysian Bandolier is good just because you can spam them while you're fighting bosses. Death Defying is good for normal farming because if you're at the end game, most enemies will usually get close to one-shotting you, and so Death Defying can really help you out. Conjurer's Crucible is kind of the fan favorite for a lot of people that don't want to use Death Defying, just because if you have the Magic Find, this will allow you to farm for a longer period of time. Yeah, that's kind of it. It's unfortunate that there's so many different flasks and so few options that are actually viable. As for your emblem, Martial Emblem is a must just because you're going to need that damage for all of the end game enemies. And then if you're earlier on in the game, you could end up using Sure Strike just to get that crit hit value a little bit higher. And then otherwise, Trailblazing if you're speed farming, Zealous if you're trying to be a boss killer, because you'll notice that the Solarion actually starts with 0 energy and that slowly builds up as you fight enemies and what have you. But if you have Zealous, you can consume a flask, use your ult, which continually drains energy, so you can just keep consuming flasks over and over, and have your ult staying for an infinite amount of time. Basically, as long as you have flasks and don't toggle it off, you can just do heaps and heaps of damage. The mid-game stat goal that you're gonna focus on is around 70 to 80,000 physical damage, I guess, somewhere around there. The crit hit, you're gonna wanna try to get to 50 to 60%, just because, again, the way that stat works is once you get to 100%, you have a 100% chance of triggering crits, and then your crit damage would be somewhere around like 800%. Anything higher than that, you're gonna inevitably get as you get closer to the end game, and we'll talk more about that with our gems. But I'm just saying that if you notice one of your stats is kind of really slagging behind, then you would just kind of adjust for that. But it's not as important as you would think until you get kind of further on in the game. Another mandatory piece of advice that I need to mention is to get your classes to level 30 before you even bother checking PR and trying to figure out how to make your character stronger, because as you get to level 30, you'll unlock all of the gem slots, which in turn gives you the highest power boost in terms of both damage and just raw PR. Lastly, before we get into the gems, this is not a video focusing on coefficiency. Each of the classes has a slight nuance in their stats, and so coefficiency builds are very, very specific to the class. I might end up doing some coefficiency guides sometime next year. I don't know. It's not that important to this game unless you're in like a super end game group that's doing really, really deep delves or something like that, because for everything else, there's MasterCard. And what I mean by that is it doesn't really matter for coefficiency's sake. Now I'm gonna swap over to my Shadow Hunter before we get into the gems. We're gonna focus on all the colored gems first, keeping the cosmic gems just tucked away to the side. You don't have to follow these stats to the letter. It's just something as a frame of reference to make it digestible for you guys. So you're gonna have 3 of your lesser gems be 2 boosts physical damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3 lesser gems, you would simply swap the 2 boosts off of physical and instead have 2 boost crit damage, 1 boost physical, and no boost crit hit. Again, if there's slight variation between that, it doesn't really make as much of a difference. It's just trying to strike a nice balance between them. As for the empowered colored gems, those are all going to end up unanimously being the same as the first gems, which is 2 boost physical damage, 1 boost crit damage, and no boost to crit hit. Of course, when you get your crit hit to 100%, you can start cycling that off of your gems for more max health to give you a little bit more survivability. And all of your cosmic gems are going to be every boost into light, and then the additional stats being physical damage and crit damage. As for the empowered gem abilities, you would go for Prismatic Link. So this makes it so that Prismatic Blast now pulses around the Phoenix as well as the Solarion, allowing the Solarion to maintain range while attacking. More so it's because you can double stack the damage, because it'll end up dealing area of effect damage around your Phoenix as well as you. And then in most cases, I would just go for Pyrodisc no matter what, because that movement speed can be really, really nice while you're out farming. Explosive Epilogue can also be really nice because it is a ranged character. It really does depend if you're trying to build the class to fighting large groups of enemies, because as I mentioned previously, you will have to have your Crystal Ring effect triggered. And then other than that, it's kind of up to you. You could use, well, not Volatile Velocity, that's kind of worthless on him. You could use a Cubic Curtain to keep yourself alive. Sunburst, I think, triggers some sort of area of effect, or maybe it's the flower one. One of those works really well with the Solarion just because it's more damage over time. And as far as I remember, I didn't test this myself, I just had somebody tell me, it does trigger a lot of your passive damage over time effects on the Solarion, so it can end up being really, really good. Somebody correct me in the comments about that. And then as for your Cosmic Gem, that kind of depends again. In most cases, you would go for Berserk Battler just because that's gonna give you more raw damage, and that's where this class shines. But Vampirium would give you the movement speed. It does give you Life Leech as well, but that's pretty irrelevant once you get Life Leech out of the skill tree. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first type of video I've ever done like this, where it's just a compilation of all of the other videos I had throughout the year. I don't know if I'm going to end up doing this very often, but I did kind of think it was an interesting project at the least. I was also quite surprised with how long this video turned out to be. But anyways, be sure to like, subscribe, all that stuff.